They say you can't choose your family, but you can choose whether they deserve a front row seat to your success. For 35 years, I was the daughter they forgot at birthday parties, the graduate. They never showed up for the invisible ghost at every family gathering. While my brother got champagne toasts and standing ovations, I got polite nods and quick subject changes. So when my mother called to tell me I wasn't successful enough for their exclusive Christmas party, I did something unexpected. I agreed with her. "You're absolutely right, Mum," I said, smiling into the phone. "I'll stay home." But here's what she didn't know: I wasn't staying home. And I wasn't arriving empty-handed. Because while they were sipping vintage wine and congratulating each other on their perfect lives, I was about to land something on their snow-covered lawn that would shatter every assumption they'd ever made about me. The jet engine started exactly at 7:47 p.m. And by 7:48, my family's world would never be the same. Stick around, because what happens next? They never saw it coming. My name is Caroline Knight. I'm 35 years old, an aerospace engineer by training. And if you looked me up online, which my family never has, you'd find I'm the CEO of Aquila Air, a private aviation company with 200 employees and 50 million in annual revenue. But at my parents' dinner table in their Connecticut mansion, I might as well be invisible. I twisted my grandfather's old watch around my wrist, a nervous habit I developed over the years. It was the only piece of jewellery I wore consistently, a battered Timex with a leather strap that had seen better days. Grandpa gave it to me when I was 10, the same year I built my first model airplane in his workshop. That plane still sits on my desk in San Francisco, a reminder of the one person in this family who ever believed I could fly. "Robert just made partner at Whitmore and Associates," my mother announced, her voice carrying that particular brightness she reserved for my brother's accomplishments. She set down her wine glass with a delicate clink, her diamond bracelet catching the chandelier light. "The youngest partner in the firm's history. Can you imagine?" Around the table, there were murmurs of congratulation. My father nodded approvingly from the head of the table, his silence somehow louder than words. Robert, sitting directly across from me, accepted the praise with practiced humility, though I caught the slight smirk that tugged at the corner of his mouth. "That's wonderful, Robert," I said, meaning it. Whatever else he was, my brother had worked hard for his position. My mother's gaze drifted toward me, as if she'd suddenly remembered I was there. "And, Caroline dear, are you still doing that engineering thing? As if I were tinkering with model trains in a garage, rather than designing aircraft that were revolutionising private aviation. But I'd learnt long ago that correcting her only led to awkward silences and quick subject changes. "Yes, Mother, still engineering." I kept my smile in place, the one I'd perfected over 3 decades. Polite, pleasant, forgettable. The conversation moved on without me, as it always did. I sat there cutting my salmon into precise pieces and realised something I'd been avoiding for years. My deepest fear wasn't that my family hated me. Hate requires attention, energy, emotion. No, what terrified me was something far worse. I was completely forgettable to them. If I disappeared tomorrow, how long would it take before they noticed? A day, a week? Or would they simply set one fewer place at the table and carry on with their elegant dinners and their discussions of Robert's brilliance? That evening, back in my hotel room, I lay in bed scrolling through my phone. The family group chat, the one I was technically part of, but rarely contributed to, this suddenly exploded with activity. My mother had sent a message at 9:47 p.m. "Exciting news, we're hosting the most exclusive Christmas party on December 24th. Black tie, of course, only our closest friends and family." I watched as the messages rolled in. Robert responded immediately with enthusiasm. My father sent a thumbs up emoji. Aunts, uncles, and cousins I barely knew chimed in with excited replies. They discussed caterers and wine selections and whether the string quartet or the jazz trio would be more appropriate. I scrolled through every message twice looking for my name, looking for any indication that I was expected, invited, or even considered. It wasn't there. I stared at my phone watching them plan the most elegant Christmas ever, and realised something with crystal clarity: I wasn't on the guest list. I never had been. I should have gone to sleep. I should have closed the group chat, turned off my phone and let it go. But instead, I lay there in the dark hotel room, watching message after message scroll past each one, a small confirmation that I'd been edited out of my own family story. 2 days later, on December 12th, my mother called. I was back in San Francisco by then, sitting in my office, with the city skyline spread out before me like a promise. When her name appeared on my screen, I almost didn't answer. But old habits die hard, and I was still, despite everything, my mother's daughter. "Darling," she began, her voice carrying that particular tone of careful pleasantness she used when delivering bad news. "I wanted to speak with you about the Christmas party." I waited, saying nothing. "It's going to be quite exclusive this year," she continued. "We're keeping it intimate, just our closest circle. And I thought, well, perhaps it's better if you sit this one out, for everyone's comfort. For everyone's comfort. Not mine, of course. Never mine." As she spoke, something strange happened. Instead of the familiar ache of rejection, I found myself drifting backward through time, watching a series of scenes play out in my mind like a film reel I'd seen too many times before. I was 8 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with Martha, our housekeeper, who had hastily baked me a small chocolate cake. It was my birthday. My parents had simply forgotten. When I'd mentioned it at breakfast, tearful and confused, my mother had looked up from her newspaper with mild annoyance. "Don't be so dramatic, Caroline. Birthdays aren't that important. Robert had gotten a party with a magician 2 months earlier." I got Martha's pity cake and a pat on the head. Then, I was 16, standing alone in my high school auditorium in my graduation gown. I'd been valedictorian, had worked myself nearly sick to earn that honour. But my parents' seats remained empty throughout the entire ceremony. They'd driven to New Haven instead, 3 hours away, because Robert was receiving some award at a mock trial competition. "It's a significant achievement," my father had explained on the phone that morning. "You understand, don't you, Caroline? Your graduation is just a formality." I'd accepted my diploma, walked across that stage, and smiled for a photograph with my principal, because there was no one else to take my picture. At 22, I graduated from MIT summa cum laude with a degree in aerospace engineering. I was one of only 3 women in my program to receive that distinction. I'd sent my parents the invitation weeks in advance, had even called to remind them. The morning of the ceremony, my mother texted, "Robert just made law review. Big celebration tonight. So proud, congrats on your graduation, dear." I'd stood in the crowd of families afterward, watching my classmates embrace their parents, and felt a loneliness so profound it was almost physical. I'd mailed them a photo of me in my cap and gown. 3 weeks later, my mother sent a brief reply. "That's nice, dear. Robert just made law review." When I was 28, Forbes named me to their 30 under 30 list for manufacturing and industry. I'd designed an engine component that reduced fuel consumption by 30%. Major aviation companies were taking notice. I was building something real, something that mattered. I'd called my mother, genuinely excited for the first time in years, thinking maybe this would be enough. Maybe this achievement would finally register. I could hear the dinner party in the background, the clink of glasses, the murmur of conversation. "That's lovely, dear," she'd said, distracted, then away from the phone but still audible. "Everyone, Robert just won the Hendrickson case, a toast." She'd hung up without saying goodbye. And now, at 35, here I was again, still hoping, still waiting to be seen. My mother's voice pulled me back to the present. "It's not personal, Caroline. You understand. You're just different. Independent types don't fit the atmosphere we're creating. We're going for a certain elegance, a certain tone. You've always been so focused on your work, so serious. We want the evening to be light, celebratory. You understand, don't you?" Independent types, as if my independence had been a choice rather than a necessity. I looked at my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling window, the city lights twinkling behind me like stars. For 35 years I'd been playing a role. The understanding daughter, the one who didn't make waves, the one who smiled and nodded and pretended it didn't hurt. Of course, Mother, I heard myself say, my voice steady and gracious, I wouldn't want to ruin your evening. There was an audible sigh of relief on her end. I knew you'd understand, darling. You've always been so reasonable about these things. We exchanged a few more pleasantries, the kind of empty words that fill space without meaning anything. When I hung up, I continued staring at my reflection in the window, the phone still warm in my hand. But something had shifted. The hurt I'd carried for decades, that familiar weight in my chest, had transformed into something else entirely. Not anger exactly, not even sadness anymore. It was clarity, sharp and clean as a blade. I wasn't hurt. I was done. Standing there with the phone in my hand, staring at my reflection against the San Francisco skyline, I found myself thinking back to the moment when I first learned what it meant to truly stand alone. It was MIT, and I was 18 years old. My acceptance letter had arrived in the early spring of my senior year of high school. A full academic scholarship, merit-based, covering tuition room and board. I'd worked for it with a singular focus that bordered on obsession, knowing it was my only path forward. When I showed my parents, my father had nodded once and returned to his newspaper. My mother had said, "How practical." 3 days later, they'd thrown Robert a graduation party that cost more than my entire first year of college expenses would have been without the scholarship. Robert had gone to Yale Law. My parents bought him a penthouse apartment in New Haven, fully furnished with a view of the harbour. They hired an interior decorator. My mother posted photos on social media with captions about her son's promising future. I arrived at MIT with 2 suitcases, a used laptop, and my grandfather's watch. My dorm room was a cramped double I shared with a biochemistry major from Ohio, who kept fermented cabbage in our mini fridge. While my classmates talked about their summer internships in Switzerland and their families' vacation homes in the Hamptons, I calculated how many shifts I'd need to work to afford textbooks. I found 2 jobs within the first month. Mornings, I shelved books at the university library, a quiet job that let me study during slow periods. Evenings and weekends, I worked at a cafe near campus, serving overpriced lattes to students who didn't blink at $5 coffee. I became intimately familiar with instant ramen, learning to dress it up with stolen packets of soy sauce and the occasional egg when I could afford the luxury. My classmates returned from winter break with tans from Ibiza and stories about skiing in the Alps. I'd spent the break working double shifts and sleeping on a friend's couch in Boston because the dorms were closed and I had nowhere else to go. But I learned something during those years, something my privileged classmates would never understand. I learned that hunger, the real kind that gnaws at you in the early morning hours when you're still studying and your stomach is empty, can become fuel if you let it. Every dismissive comment from my mother, every family gathering I wasn't invited to, every moment of being invisible, became another reason to push harder. Finals week of my junior year nearly broke me. I'd been working on a robotics project that required programming an autonomous flight system. The code wasn't cooperating, and I'd spent 72 hours straight in the lab, surviving on vending machine coffee and sheer stubbornness. I must have fallen asleep at my workstation because the next thing I knew, Professor Chen was shaking my shoulder gently. It was 3 a.m. The lab was empty except for us. "Ms. Knight," he said, his voice kind but concerned. "When did you last eat or sleep in an actual bed?" I tried to stand, mortified, but my legs were stiff from hours in the same position. "I'm sorry, Professor. I'll clean up and go." He pulled up a chair and sat across from me, studying my face with the same intensity he brought to analysing mechanical systems. "You're going to burn out if you keep this pace." "I can't afford to burn out," I said, and heard the exhaustion in my own voice. "I don't have a safety net." Professor Chen was quiet for a moment. Then he said something I've never forgotten. "You have something most of these students don't. You have hunger. real hunger. Not for money or status, but for achievement. For proof that you exist, that you matter. He leaned forward. Use it, but don't let it consume you. The best engineers I've known weren't the ones with the most resources. They were the ones who had something to prove. I graduated summa cum laude in May, one of 3 women in my program to receive that distinction. The ceremony was on a bright Saturday morning, families crowding the lawn in their spring dresses and proud smiles. I sat alone in the sea of graduates, watching my classmates embrace their parents, pose for photographs, celebrate their achievements with the people who had believed in them from the beginning. After the ceremony, I asked a passing graduate's father if he'd mind taking my picture. He did it kindly, even took several to make sure I had a good one. I sent the best one to my parents that evening with a simple message: graduated today, summa cum laude, thought you'd want to know. The response came 3 weeks later. I was already working my first internship, already beginning to build the foundation of what would become my career. My mother's text was brief. That's nice, dear. Robert just made law review. I read it twice, sitting on the edge of my rented bed, in a tiny apartment I shared with 2 other interns. Something inside me went very quiet, very still. I made myself a promise in that moment, a silent vow that I thought would protect me. I'll never need their applause again. What I didn't understand then, couldn't have understood, was that silence has its own weight. That absence can echo louder than any cheer, can shape you in ways that presence never could. I thought I was building walls to protect myself. I didn't realize I was constructing the foundation of an empire. Boeing hired me 2 weeks later. I thought I'd finally proved them wrong. I had no idea the real battle was just beginning. Boeing's Seattle headquarters was a cathedral of metal and glass, a place where giants of engineering walked the halls, and the smell of jet fuel mixed with ambition. I arrived fresh from MIT with my diploma, my hunger, and a naive belief that merit would be enough. I learned otherwise within my first week. The engineering department was a sea of men in button-down shirts and sensible ties. In my first team meeting, I sat at the conference table with my notebook and ideas ready to contribute. The project leader, man named Doug Brennan, with 20 years of experience and a gut that spoke to too many business lunches, looked at me with what I initially mistook for kindness. "Sweetheart," he said, sliding a legal pad across the table. "Would you mind taking notes for us women have such neat handwriting?" I felt every eye in the room turn to me. Some of the men looked uncomfortable. Most looked expectant. 1 or 2 smirked. I could have objected. I could have reminded him that I was hired as an engineer, not a secretary. Instead, I smiled, picked up the pen, and took the most detailed notes of my career. I documented every idea, every suggestion, every comment made in that meeting. When projects succeeded, I had records of who contributed what. When they failed, I knew exactly where the breakdown occurred. I learned to keep my head down and my documentation meticulous. While my male colleagues grabbed beers after work and made connections that led to better projects, I stayed late in the lab running simulations and perfecting designs. I worked twice as hard for half the recognition, and I told myself it was temporary, that eventually the work would speak for itself. At 24, I designed a fuel efficiency modification that could reduce consumption by 18% on mid-range aircraft. It was elegant, simple, and revolutionary. I presented it to my team lead, a senior engineer named Marcus Webb, who'd been with Boeing for 15 years. He'd seemed impressed, asked thoughtful questions, requested my full documentation to review. 6 weeks later, Marcus presented my design to upper management as his own innovation. I sat in that meeting watching him walk through my calculations, my simulations, my breakthrough, and claim credit for every element. When executives praised his ingenuity, he accepted with humble nods. When they asked technical questions, he fumbled, looking to me for answers that I provided through gritted teeth. I could have exposed him. I could have shown the timestamps on my files, the emails I'd sent, the documented trail of my work. But I'd learned something by then. Fighting publicly would label me as difficult, as someone who couldn't work with a team, as a woman who was too emotional about ownership. So, I said nothing. I went back to my desk, opened a new project file, and designed a better engine. The workload became crushing. I was determined to be so good, so undeniably excellent that they couldn't ignore me or steal from me. I arrived at 6 in the morning and left at 10 at night. Weekends disappeared into spreadsheets and CAD models. I survived on coffee and takeout eaten at my desk. My small apartment became just a place to sleep for a few hours before returning to the lab. At 26, I noticed my hair coming out in clumps in the shower. Stress, my doctor said, my body's way of telling me I was pushing too hard. I looked at myself in the mirror at the thinning patches and the exhaustion carved into my face and made a decision. I walked into a salon and had them cut it all short, a practical pixie cut that took 5 minutes to style. My colleagues whispered about it. Too severe, one said, trying to be one of the boys, another suggested. Too ambitious for her own good, I heard someone mutter in the break room. I ignored them all. I'd learned that being liked and being respected were two different things, and I'd chosen which one mattered. By 27, I'd contributed to 3 major projects that had saved Boeing millions in operational costs. My name appeared in internal reports, always buried in team credits, never featured prominently. But industry people were starting to notice. Aviation magazines mentioned Boeing's innovative engineering team. Recruiters began calling. Then, at 28, Forbes named me to their 30 under 30 list in the manufacturing and industry category. The notification came through on a Tuesday afternoon. I stood in the Boeing parking lot staring at my phone, reading the citation about my contributions to fuel efficiency and sustainable aviation design. For the first time in 6 years, I felt something like validation from a source outside my own drive. I called my mother without thinking, muscle memory overriding better judgment. I was genuinely excited, foolishly hopeful that maybe this achievement would be visible enough, impressive enough to finally register. She answered on the 4th ring. I could hear a dinner party in the background, the elegant clink of crystal glasses and cultured laughter. Caroline? Is everything all right? Mum, I just found out I made the Forbes 30 under 30 list. For my work in aerospace engineering, they featured my fuel efficiency designs and... That's lovely, dear, she said, her voice distracted. Then, away from the phone, but still audible. Her tone was transformed into genuine excitement. Everyone, Robert just won the Hendrickson case. A major victory, let's toast. The background erupted in congratulations. The line went dead. She'd hung up without saying goodbye. I stood in that parking lot as the Seattle rain began to fall, holding my phone, and something inside me went very quiet. That evening, I bought a copy of the magazine at a newsstand. My photograph was on page 43, a professional headshot with a 2-paragraph write-up about my innovations. I stared at my Forbes magazine cover that night and realised I was building an empire for an audience that would never show up. That realisation should have crushed me, but instead it clarified something I'd been avoiding for years. If I was building something magnificent that no one in my family would ever appreciate, then why was I building it for someone else's company? Why was I making other people rich with my innovations while accepting crumbs of recognition? 3 months after the Forbes recognition, Boeing offered me a vice president position. At 28, I would have been one of the youngest VPs in the company's history. The salary was $200,000 a year, plus stock options and benefits that included everything from healthcare to a retirement plan that would set me up for life. It was security, stability, everything I'd worked towards since leaving home at 18. I sat in the HR director's office looking at the contract on the desk between us and heard my grandfather's voice in my head. He died when I was 17, shortly before I left for MIT. In his final days, when the cancer had reduced him to a whisper, he'd gripped my hand and said something I'd carried with me ever since. Safe is slow death, Caroline. Don't let fear make you small. I I turned down the VP position the next morning and submitted my resignation 2 weeks later. My colleagues thought I'd lost my mind. A few were supportive, most were baffled, and several were openly gleeful at what they assumed would be my imminent failure. I cleaned out my desk on a Friday afternoon, loaded my personal belongings into my aging Honda Civic, and drove south to San Jose with $50,000 in savings and a head full of designs that Boeing would never build. I rented a garage space in an industrial area where the rent was cheap and the neighbours didn't ask questions. It smelled like motor oil and had exactly one working electrical outlet, but it was mine. I bought used equipment scrounged parts from aerospace surplus stores and started building the prototype for what would eventually become the Aquila 9's revolutionary engine design. The first 6 months were hard. The next 12 were hell. I pitched my concept to 47 different investors. Venture capitalists in Silicon Valley looked at my designs with polite interest and then asked if I had a male co-founder who could handle the business side. Angel investors questioned whether there was really a market for more efficient private aircraft. One memorable meeting ended with a man in an expensive suit telling me I should consider going back to a stable job before I wasted my youth on a pipe dream. I slept on a used couch I dragged into the garage, showered at a gym membership I could barely afford, and survived on whatever I could get from vending machines and the dollar menu at fast food restaurants. My savings dwindled with terrifying speed. Every prototype failure cost money I didn't have. Every rejected pitch meant another week closer to bankruptcy. I stopped calling my family, partly because I was ashamed of what my life had become, but mostly because I knew they wouldn't understand. The last time I'd spoken to my mother about 8 months into this venture, she'd asked what I was doing these days. When I tried to explain about starting my own aerospace company, she'd made a small sound of concern and said, "Oh, Caroline, wouldn't it be wiser to just get a normal job?" At 29, I hit bottom. My bank account showed $347. I hadn't had a real meal in 3 days. The prototype I'd been working on for 4 months had failed its pressure test, and I didn't have the money to buy the materials to rebuild it. I sat on the concrete floor of that garage at 2 a.m, surrounded by failed designs and broken dreams, and felt the weight of every decision that had led me to this moment. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts, past my parents' numbers, past Robert's, until I found the one person who'd ever treated me like I mattered. Martha answered on the second ring, her voice thick with sleep. "Caroline, child, what's wrong?" I tried to speak and found myself crying. Instead, great gasping sobs that I'd been holding back for months. "Martha, I don't know if I can do this. I think I've made a terrible mistake. I had a good job, and I walked away, and now I have nothing. I'm living in a garage. I can't even afford groceries. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe I should have just stayed small and safe and—" "Stop," Martha said, her voice firm but gentle. "Stop right there. You listen to me, Caroline Knight. You're already doing it. You're already building something extraordinary. You just can't see it yet because you're standing too close." "I'm failing, Martha." "No, child. You're learning. There's a difference." I heard her shift in bed, could picture her in the small room off the kitchen in my parents' Connecticut mansion. "Your grandfather would be so proud of you. Not because you're succeeding, but because you're not afraid to fail. That takes more courage than playing it safe ever could." We talked for another hour. She told me about her own mother, who'd started a dressmaking business, with nothing but a borrowed sewing machine and determination. She reminded me that anything worth building takes time, takes sacrifice, takes faith when there's no logical reason to have any. When I finally hung up, the sun was beginning to rise over San Jose. I was still broke, still living in a garage, still facing impossible odds. But something had shifted. I wasn't ready to give up yet. The next morning, I checked my email and found a message from someone identifying themselves only as A. Knight Investments, LLC. The message was brief. "Reviewed your pitch deck. Interested in discussing terms. Available today." By that evening, I had a commitment for $200,000 in exchange for 5% equity in a company that existed only in my designs and determination. I didn't know then that investor number 48 wasn't a stranger. It was someone who'd been watching all along. That investment changed everything. Within 3 months, I had a working prototype. Within 6 months, I had my first client, a small charter company in Nevada, willing to take a chance on an unknown engineer with a revolutionary design. By the time I turned 31, I had 3 clients and enough revenue to move out of the garage and into actual office space. The growth was exponential in ways I hadn't dared to imagine. At 32, I hired my 50th employee, a milestone that felt impossible just 2 years earlier. We'd scaled production, refined the design, and secured contracts with mid-sized aviation companies looking for fuel-efficient alternatives. Revenue hit $20 million that year, and suddenly, the industry publications that had ignored me at Boeing were requesting interviews. At 33, we launched the Aquila 7, our first fully commercial model. It was beautiful, efficient, and everything I dreamed of building back in that garage. Airlines noticed. Private aviation companies noticed. Most importantly, the market noticed. By 34, Forbes was calling again, but this time for a different list. Billionaire under 35 felt surreal, a designation that belonged to tech founders and inherited wealth, not to a woman who'd been sleeping on a garage couch just 4 years earlier. The article featured a photo of me standing in front of our newest prototype, arms crossed, allowing myself the smallest hint of a smile. I didn't call my mother about that one. Now, at 35, Aquila Air employed 200 people across 3 facilities. Our flagship model, the Aquila 9, was revolutionizing private aviation with its unprecedented fuel efficiency and range. We had a waiting list of clients and enough capital to expand internationally. The girl who'd worked double shifts to afford textbooks was now signing contracts worth millions. I'd built an empire. I'd done it alone, and my family had no idea. That was the context on December 18th, 6 days before my mother's exclusive Christmas party, when my phone rang and Martha's name appeared on the screen. "Martha," I said warmly, leaning back in my office chair. "How are you?" "Oh, child," she said, and something in her voice made me sit up straighter. "I need to tell you something. About the Christmas party." My heart rate picked up slightly. "What about it?" There was a long pause, the kind of silence that precedes confessions. "Caroline, that invitation you received, the one that came in the mail, I sent it. Your mother never meant to include you on the guest list. I just thought I wanted them to see you one more time. I'm sorry if I overstepped." I should have been surprised, but I wasn't. Some part of me had known all along. "It's all right, Martha. Thank you for telling me." "There's more," she continued, her voice dropping. "I overheard your mother on the phone yesterday. She was talking to the party planner." I waited, my fingers tightening around the phone. "She told them you might try to come anyway. She said..." Martha's voice caught. "She said you've been having some emotional difficulties, that you might cause a scene. She instructed the security staff to turn you away at the gate if you showed up." The words landed like physical blows. Emotional difficulties, as if my success, my competence, my entire career could be dismissed as instability. "I see," I said quietly. "Caroline, I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have sent that invitation. I just keep hoping they'll wake up and see what they're losing. But they're so caught up in their own world, their own pride." "Martha," I interrupted gently, "it's not your fault. None of this has ever been your fault." After we hung up, I sat motionless for several minutes, staring out at the San Francisco skyline. Then, I called an old college friend who'd stayed in Connecticut, someone who still moved in my parents' social circles. "Jessica," I said when she answered, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "Of course. What's going on?" "My mother's Christmas party. Have you heard anything about me in relation to it?" The hesitation on the other end told me everything. "Caroline, I wasn't sure if I should mention it. She sent an email to the guest list a few days ago, just a brief note saying that if you happen to show up, we should all be understanding because you've been going through some personal issues. She didn't specify what kind, but the implication was clear. Personal issues, emotionally unstable. My mother had poisoned the well before I could even approach it, ensuring that if I did appear, every guest would view me through the lens of her carefully constructed narrative. The brilliant daughters would be reframed as the troubled one, the embarrassment, the family problem. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "Caroline, for what it's worth, I don't believe a word of it. I've been following your company. What you've built is incredible." After that call, I sat in my office as the afternoon light faded into evening. My team had gone home hours ago. The building was quiet except for the hum of computers and the distant sound of traffic below. On my desk sat a scale model of the Aquila 9, that sleek private jet I'd designed myself. Every curve, every innovation, every detail represented years of work, sacrifice, and determination. It represented the girl who'd eaten instant ramen to afford textbooks, the woman who'd slept on a garage floor to build her dreams, the CEO who now commanded respect in one of the most competitive industries in the world. My mother thought I had personal issues. She'd told her friends to pity me, instructed security to turn me away, tried to humiliate me before I could even arrive. I stared at the Aquila 9 model on my desk, that sleek private jet I designed myself, and picked up my phone. I texted my pilot 2 words: Connecticut, tomorrow. The next morning, December 19th, I boarded a commercial flight to Hartford. I could have taken one of our company aircraft, but I wasn't ready to show my hand yet. I wanted to arrive quietly to prepare without drawing attention. I checked into a hotel near my parents' estate, unpacked my suitcase, and then did something I hadn't done in years. I drove to my childhood home. My parents were out attending some charity luncheon, according to the schedule my mother maintained with military precision. The house key was still where Martha had always kept a spare under the 3rd flower pot on the back terrace. I let myself in through the kitchen door, breathing in the familiar scent of lemon polish and old money. The house was exactly as I remembered, and yet felt completely foreign, like walking through a museum of someone else's childhood. I climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor, my footsteps silent on the Persian runner, and stood outside my old bedroom door. I hadn't been inside this room in over a decade. It had been converted into a guest room, all traces of my existence carefully erased. The posters I'd hung were gone, replaced by tasteful landscape paintings. My bookshelf had been removed, the space now occupied by a decorative armoire. Even the pale blue I'd painted the walls at 16 had been covered with a neutral beige. I walked to the closet, not sure what I was looking for. Maybe evidence that I'd existed here once, some proof that this had been my home, and not just a way station. The closet was mostly empty now, holding only spare linens and a few boxes of holiday decorations. But in the back corner, pushed behind a stack of winter blankets, I found a small cardboard box with my name written on it in faded marker. I pulled it out and sat on the floor, dust motes dancing in the afternoon light streaming through the window. Inside were remnants of my childhood: a participation ribbon from elementary school track and field, a dried corsage from a dance I'd attended, alone, my high school yearbook report cards that documented my straight A's. At the bottom, tucked into an envelope, were photographs. Most were of Robert at various ages, his milestones carefully documented. But there was one that made me stop breathing. It showed a little girl, maybe 7 years old, standing in front of this very house. She wore a yellow sundress and had dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She was smiling at the camera with a gap-toothed grin that lit up her whole face. She looked remarkably like me, like she could have been me, except the inscription on the back read Sarah, age 7, summer 1987. My hands started shaking. I pulled out my phone and called Martha. She answered on the first ring as if she'd been waiting. "Caroline, are you all right?" "Martha, I'm at the house. I found a photograph of a girl named Sarah." "Sure." My voice came out steadier than I felt. "Who is she?" The silence that followed was heavy with old grief. "Oh, child, I wondered if you'd ever find out. Sarah was your sister, your older sister." The room seemed to tilt. "I don't have a sister." "You did, baby. Sarah was 7 years old when you were born. She was the light of your parents' lives, especially your mother's. They doted on that little girl." Martha's voice grew softer, sadder. "When you were 6 months old, there was an accident. Your mother was driving. She'd put your car seat in the front passenger seat so she could keep an eye on you. Sarah was in the back." I closed my eyes, already knowing where this was going. "A truck ran a red light, hit them from behind. Sarah died instantly. You had minor injuries, just some bruises from the car seat straps. But Sarah," Martha's voice broke, "your mother held her baby girl while she died, Caroline, and the whole time she could hear you crying in the front seat, alive and unhurt." The photograph slipped from my fingers. "She blamed me." "No, child, it wasn't that simple. Your mother blamed herself. She told me once years later when she'd had too much wine that she couldn't stop thinking about how she'd made the choice to put you up front, how if she'd put Sarah there instead, or if she'd put both of you in the back, or if she'd just taken a different route that day. The guilt consumed her, and every time she looked at you, she saw the choice she'd made and the daughter she'd lost because of it." I stared at the photograph of Sarah, at that joyful 7-year-old who'd never gotten the chance to grow up, to go to college, to build a life. That's why she could never love me. It's not that she couldn't love you, Caroline. It's that loving you meant accepting Sarah's death, accepting her own guilt, facing a grief so overwhelming that she locked it away instead. She never got help, never processed it. She just buried it deep and tried to pretend it never happened. But you were there, a constant reminder. You looked like Sarah. You had her same stubborn determination, her same intelligence. And I think that made it worse. So, I became invisible because seeing me was too painful. Your mother never healed, child. She just learned to survive by not looking too closely at what she'd lost or what she still had. It's not fair to you. It never was. But it's her truth, twisted as it is. I thought about all the forgotten birthdays, the missed graduations, the casual dismissals. I thought about spending 35 years trying to earn love from a woman who couldn't bear to see me because I represented the wrong daughter surviving. "Does my father know?" I asked quietly. "He knows. He was there that day, but he deals with grief differently, by retreating into work, into silence. He failed you both in different ways." After we hung up, I sat on the floor of my childhood bedroom that was no longer mine, holding the photograph of the sister I never knew existed. I traced the outline of her face with my finger, this ghost who had shaped my entire life without my knowledge. I held that photograph of the sister I never knew and finally understood. I wasn't hated. I was a ghost haunting my mother's unhealed wound. Understanding my mother's pain didn't erase mine. That was what I realised over the 5 days between finding Sarah's photograph and Christmas Eve. I could hold both truths at once, that my mother had suffered an unimaginable loss and that she had made me suffer for it. Compassion didn't require me to accept a lifetime of invisibility. So, on December 24th, as the winter sun set over Connecticut and the temperature dropped below freezing, I prepared to be seen. I dressed carefully that evening, standing in my hotel room and considering my options. I could have worn something dramatic, something that screamed success and demanded attention. Instead, I chose simplicity. A black wool coat that I'd bought off the rack 3 years ago, well made but unremarkable. Black pants and boots. My hair, still short from my bowing days, needed nothing more than running my fingers through it. I wore my grandfather's watch and no other jewellery. I wanted them to see me, not my costume. The town car I'd hired was equally modest, a black sedan that could have belonged to anyone. As we turned onto the long driveway leading to my parents' estate, I watched the transformation of landscape from ordinary road to manicured perfection. The driveway was lined with luminarias, small paper bags weighted with sand and glowing with candlelight. It looked like a scene from a magazine spread, which I suppose was the point. The cars ahead of us told their own story. A silver Bentley, 2 Rolls Royces, one vintage, one new, a Tesla that probably cost more than most people's houses, a Mercedes with diplomatic plates. These were my parents' people, the ones who measured worth in brand names and square footage. We pulled up to the gate at exactly 7 p.m. Through the wrought iron bars, I could see the mansion ablaze with light, every window glowing warm against the cold night. The house looked like something from a Christmas card, all elegant proportions and tasteful decorations. Figures moved past the windows, silhouettes holding champagne flutes, heads thrown back in laughter. A security guard approached the car professional in his dark suit and earpiece. He carried an iPad, the guest list no doubt pulled up and ready. The driver rolled down my window. "Good evening," the guard said, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Name, please." "Caroline Knight," I said clearly. He looked down at his iPad, scrolling with his thumb. His brow furrowed slightly. He scrolled back up, then down again, taking his time. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I don't see a Caroline Knight on the list. Perhaps there's been a mistake. Could it be under a different name?" "No mistake," I said. "Just Knight. Caroline Knight." He checked a third time, being thorough, probably thinking I'd be embarrassed enough to leave. "I apologise, but I'm not able to grant entry without a name on the approved list. Perhaps you could call the hosts and—" "That won't be necessary," I said quietly. Through the gates and the windows, I could see into the grand foyer. The party was in full swing, a sea of designer gowns and tuxedos jewellery that caught the chandelier light, the kind of elegant gathering my mother had spent weeks planning. And there near the window, champagne glass in hand, stood my mother herself. She wore a deep burgundy gown that probably cost more than my first car. Her hair was swept up in an intricate style, diamonds at her throat and ears. She was speaking to someone, an older woman in silver silk, when something made her glance toward the gate. Our eyes met across the distance. I watched her face change. First surprise, quickly masked. Then something that looked almost like satisfaction. She'd been expecting this, I realised. She'd been waiting to see if I'd be foolish enough to show up to be turned away at her gates like an unwanted solicitor. She leaned toward the woman in silver, whispered something behind her hand. The woman glanced toward the gate, toward me, and I saw pity cross her face. This was it, the moment my mother had orchestrated. The final humiliation witnessed by her social circle, proof that I didn't belong. The security guard was speaking into his radio, probably confirming with someone inside that I was indeed not welcome. Other cars were beginning to line up behind mine, more guests arriving for the exclusive event. I pulled out my phone with steady hands and typed a single word to the number I'd programmed 3 days ago. "Now." The guard leaned down toward my window again. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to move your vehicle. You're blocking the entrance for—" And then, cutting through the cold December night air, came a sound that made crystal glasses tremble on silver trays. The sound started low, a distant rumble that could have been mistaken for thunder if the sky weren't perfectly clear. But it grew rapidly, that distinctive roar of jet engines that anyone who'd spent time around aircraft would recognise immediately. The security guard's head snapped up his hand instinctively, going to his earpiece as if someone inside might explain what was happening. The Aquila 9 came in low over the tree line, its landing lights blazing like small suns against the darkness. At 500 feet, it was close enough that every detail was visible, the swept-wing design. I'd spent 3 years perfecting the sleek fuselage that reduced drag by 18% compared to competitors, and most importantly, the logo, emblazoned on both sides in the letters 3 feet tall, Aquila Air. The aircraft banked gracefully, circling the estate in a slow, deliberate pattern. Its light swept across the snow-covered lawn, illuminating the frozen landscape like a spotlight. The sound was magnificent, powerful, a declaration that couldn't be ignored. Inside the mansion, I watched the party fracture. Guests abandoned their conversations mid-sentence and rushed toward the windows. Some pushed through the front doors and out onto the circular driveway, champagne still in hand, fur stoles clutched around shoulders against the sudden cold. Within seconds, at least 50 people were outside, faces turned skyward, pointing and talking over the engine noise. The security guard's iPad slipped from his hands and clattered to the pavement. He didn't notice. He was staring up at the jet with his mouth slightly open, all protocol forgotten. Through the chaos of guests flooding outside, I caught glimpses of my family. Robert stood frozen on the front steps. His conversation partner abandoned his expression, one of complete disbelief. He had been gesturing with his champagne glass when the jet appeared, and his hand was still raised mid-gesture, as if someone had pressed pause on Han's life. My mother had been standing near the window. I watched her champagne glass slip from her fingers in slow motion, the crystal shattering on the marble floor burgundy liquid, spreading across the white stone like a stain. Her face had gone completely pale. Her carefully composed expression cracked wide open into something raw and unguarded. The jet completed another circle lower this time, and I could see the pilot's silhouette in the cockpit. He waggled the wings once, a subtle acknowledgement of the spectacle we'd created, then pulled up and away, climbing back into the night sky. The engine noise began to fade, leaving behind a stunned silence, broken only by the excited murmur of guests. I opened the car door and stepped out into the cold. The security guard turned to me, his professional composure completely shattered. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "That would be my aircraft," I said, calmly adjusting my coat. "I'll see myself in now, thank you." I walked past him through the open gate. He didn't try to stop me. Several guests were still on the driveway, their conversations animated, speculative. I caught fragments as I passed. "Was that the new Aquila model? I heard those have a 6-month waiting list. Who could afford to just fly one over someone's house?" The front door stood open, abandoned by guests who'd rushed outside. I walked through it and into the grand foyer where I'd spent so many childhood hours feeling invisible. The Christmas tree touched the 20-foot ceiling, decorated with what must have been thousands of white lights and silver ornaments. A string quartet had stopped playing mid-piece, the musicians craning their necks toward the windows. Guests were streaming back inside now, their cheeks flushed with cold and excitement. My mother stood near the shattered champagne glass, seemingly unable to move. She stared at me as if I were a stranger, or perhaps a ghost made suddenly impossibly solid. An older woman in silver silk approached my mother, the same woman she'd whispered to earlier. "Patricia," she said, her voice carrying in the sudden quiet. "Isn't that the Aquila 9, the one all the aviation magazines have been featuring? My husband was just saying he wants to buy one for the company." My mother's mouth moved, but no sound came out. The woman turned to me with interest. "Are you with Aquila Air? Did they send you to demonstrate the aircraft?" What a spectacular entrance. "Not exactly," I said, meeting my mother's eyes. "I'm Caroline Knight, the CEO." The woman's eyes widened. "You're the designer, the one who created the fuel efficiency breakthrough." She looked between me and my mother with dawning comprehension. Oh, my. Patricia, is this your daughter? The one you said was..." She stopped herself, but the damage was done. Personal issues hung in the air between us, unspoken, but understood. My mother finally found her voice. You fly those things?" Something in the question, the same dismissive tone she'd used at that dinner table weeks ago, about my engineering thing, made me smile. Not with triumph exactly, with something quieter, something that felt like finally exhaling after holding my breath for 35 years. "No, Mother," I said clearly, my voice carrying across the marble foyer. "I build them." The words fell into a silence so profound I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Every guest within earshot turned to stare. I saw recognition dawn on several faces, people putting together pieces they hadn't known were part of the same puzzle. Caroline Knight, the invisible daughter. the aerospace CEO they'd read about in Forbes. In the ringing silence that followed, a voice I never expected broke through my father's. My father stepped forward from where he'd been standing near the fireplace, his hand gripping his whiskey glass with white knuckles. In the chandelier light, I could see how much he'd aged since I'd last seen him at that family dinner weeks ago. The lines around his eyes were deeper, his hair more silver than I remembered. "Caroline," he said, and his voice was soft, almost fragile. I'm glad you came." It was perhaps the most direct acknowledgement of my existence he'd given me in years. 4 simple words that somehow carried the weight of decades. I saw something in his eyes that looked almost like regret, or maybe recognition, as if he were finally seeing me clearly for the first time. My mother's head snapped toward him, her expression hardening. She shot him a look I'd seen countless times growing up, a warning that needed no words. My father's mouth closed immediately, whatever else he might have said swallowed back down. He took a long drink from his glass and retreated back to his position, by the fireplace, once again a silent observer in his own home. My mother recovered quickly, her social training reasserting itself like armour. She smoothed her gown, stepped carefully around the broken champagne glass, and arranged her face into something approximating gracious hospitality. "Well," she said, her voice carrying that practiced lightness she used with difficult situations. "How wonderful that you could join us after all, Caroline. Please, come in. We're just about to sit down for dinner." The guests began to file toward the dining room, their conversations resuming, but quieter now, charged with speculation. I heard whispered exchanges. Questions about how Patricia Knight's daughter could be the aerospace CEO. Wasn't she supposed to be having personal difficulties? Had anyone known about this? I followed the crowd into the dining room, that vast space with its mahogany table that could seat 24. It was set with my mother's finest china crystal that caught the light like ice, and centerpieces of white roses and silver branches that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Place cards and calligraphy marked where each guest should sit. My mother took her position at the head of the table, directing traffic with subtle gestures. "Caroline, darling," she said, and I marvelled at how she could make an endearment sound like a dismissal. "You'll be so much more comfortable over here." She gestured to a smaller table set up near the window, clearly meant for overflow guests who didn't quite make the cut for the main seating. The auxiliary table held the catering manager, who'd been invited to dine with the family, 2 distant cousins I barely recognised, and an elderly aunt who was half deaf and spent most gatherings confused about where she was. It was a table for people who were technically present, but not actually a part of the celebration. I sat where directed, accepting a wine glass from a server who looked almost as uncomfortable as I should have felt. From this vantage point, I could see the main table clearly. My mother sat at the head with my father at the opposite end. Robert was positioned prominently to Mother's right, surrounded by the most important guests, the ones whose opinions mattered in my parents' social calculations. Dinner was served in courses, each plate a work of art that was probably meant to be photographed for my mother's social media. At the main table, conversation flowed easily, lubricated by expensive wine and shared social currency. My mother was holding court, charming her guests with practiced ease, as if nothing unusual had happened, as if there wasn't a daughter sitting 20 feet away who'd just flown a private jet over her Christmas party. Midway through the main course, Robert stood with his wine glass raised. The room quieted immediately, all attention turning to him. He looked every inch the successful attorney in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, his posture confident, his smile easy. "I want to propose a toast," he said, his voice carrying that courtroom authority he'd perfected over years. "To family, to success, and to the continued prosperity of the Knight name." He paused, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on me at my auxiliary table. His smile widened slightly, taking on an edge I recognized from childhood. "And to my dear sister Caroline, who's apparently been quite busy building airplanes." He said it with just enough emphasis to make it sound quaint, like a hobby rather than an industry. "Maybe next year, sis, you'll earn your spot up here at the table with the real successes." Polite laughter rippled through the room, the kind that comes when people aren't sure if something is meant as a joke or an insult, but don't want to be left out. Several guests glanced between Robert and me, their expressions uncomfortable. I set down my fork carefully, took a sip of wine, and stood slowly. Every eye in the room turned to me. My mother's face went rigid, her hand tightening on her wine stem. My father looked down at his plate. Robert's smile remained fixed, but I saw uncertainty flicker in his eyes. I smiled at my brother, with genuine warmth, the kind of expression that doesn't quite reach the eyes, but looks pleasant enough from a distance. "You're absolutely right, Robert," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the hushed room. "Maybe next year things will be different." I let the ambiguity hang there for a moment, watching several interpretations play across the faces around me. Some thought I was conceding to his insult. Others looked uncertain, as if they'd caught an undertone they couldn't quite place. I picked up my evening bag and walked toward the door, my footsteps silent on the antique rug. I could feel the attention of every guest following me, could sense my mother's barely contained relief that I was leaving without causing more of a scene. I walked toward the door, and that's when Mother made her first real mistake. I was halfway down the hall toward the coat room when I heard the click of heels behind me, rapid and purposeful. I didn't need to turn around to know it was my mother. I'd been hearing that particular cadence my entire life, the sound of her approaching to deliver corrections or criticisms in a tone just quiet enough to avoid public notice. "Caroline." Her voice was low but sharp, honed by decades of maintaining composure in front of audiences. "A word, please." I stopped, but didn't turn around immediately. I could see our reflections in the darkened window at the end of the hall, two figures in a house full of light and laughter that had never included both of us at once. She followed me into the coat room, a small space off the main hall lined with mahogany panels and brass hooks. Someone's fur still hung heavily on one hook, smelling faintly of expensive perfume. The door clicked shut behind us, muffling the sounds of the party. "You've made your point," my mother said, and now that we were alone, the careful composure cracked. Her voice shook with something between rage and panic. "Flying that ridiculous plane over my home, making a spectacle, embarrassing yourself in front of my guests. You've had your moment of drama. Now please leave before you embarrass yourself further." I turned to face her fully. In the dim light of the coat room, she looked older than she had in the dining room. The carefully applied makeup, unable to hide the lines of stress around her mouth and eyes. Her hands were trembling slightly and she clasped them together to still them. "Embarrass myself," I repeated softly. "Is that what you think happened out there? What else would you call it, showing up uninvited, creating a scene sitting at that table, like some kind of martyr?" Her voice rose slightly. "You've always had this need for attention, this desperate need to prove something, and I'm tired of it, Caroline. I'm tired of you making everything about you and your feelings and your perceived slights." For 35 years, I might have accepted that characterization. Might have wondered if she was right, if I was too sensitive, too needy, too much. But I'd found Sarah's photograph. I'd learned the truth. And I was done accepting blame for a grief that had never been mine to carry. I reached into my evening bag and pulled out the photograph I'd been carrying since I found it 5 days ago. The edges were worn now from being handled, from being stared at in hotel rooms at 3 a.m. when sleep wouldn't come. I held it out to my mother. "Martha told me," I said quietly, "about the accident, about Sarah, about why you can't look at me without seeing what you lost." My mother's eyes locked onto the photograph, and for one unguarded second, her face crumbled completely. I saw raw grief flash across her features, the kind of pain that doesn't diminish with time, but only learns to hide better. Her hand reached out involuntarily, as if to take the photograph, then pulled back, as if it might burn her. "Don't you dare," she whispered, and the grief transformed instantly back into anger, that safer emotion. "You know nothing about what I've been through, nothing about what it means to—" Her voice caught. "Don't you dare use her against me." "I'm not using her against you." I said gently. I'm trying to understand why you've spent my entire life treating me like I don't exist. Why birthdays were forgotten, why graduations were missed, why every achievement I ever earned was dismissed as nice, dear, before you changed the subject to Robert. This has nothing to do with it, has everything to do with it. I kept my voice soft, not wanting to wound but needing to be heard. I know I survived, and she didn't. I know I was in the front seat and she was in the back. I know you've spent 35 years wishing it had been the other way around. My mother's breath came in short, sharp gasps. Stop. I know you blame yourself for that choice for putting me in front where I'd be safer. And I know that every time you look at me, you see her. You see the daughter you lost instead of the daughter you have. I took a step closer. And I know that I can't fix that for you. I can't bring Sarah back. I can't undo what happened. I can't make your grief go away by being invisible or by achieving enough to earn your love or by anything else I've tried for 35 years. You don't understand, my mother said, but her voice had lost its edge. She sounded exhausted, hollowed out. You can't possibly understand what it's like to hold your child while she dies. To know that if you'd made a different choice, one different choice, she'd still be alive. You're right, I said. I can't understand that. No one should have to understand that. But I do understand what it's like to grow up with a mother who can barely stand to be in the same room with me, who forgets my birthday, who tells party organisers that I'm emotionally unstable so they'll turn me away at the gate. She flinched at that last part, and I knew Jessica had been telling the truth. I placed the photograph gently on the small table near the door next to a silver tray for calling cards that no one used anymore. Sarah's 7-year-old face smiled up from the faded image frozen in a moment of joy that would never age, never change, never disappoint. I'm done trying to earn something you're not capable of giving, I said. I'm done making myself smaller so you'll be more comfortable. I'm done being invisible in my own family because my existence is painful for you. I picked up my coat from where I'd left it. I'm sorry you lost Sarah. I'm sorry you've carried that pain for so long. But I'm not sorry I survived. And I'm not going to apologise for existing anymore. I turned toward the door, my hand on the brass knob. Caroline. My mother's voice was barely a whisper. I paused but didn't turn around. Where did you get that photograph? From my old room, from a box with my name on it that you'd shoved in the back of a closet. I heard her breath catch, heard what might have been the beginning of a sob or a word, but I didn't wait to find out which. I opened the door and walked back into the hallway, leaving her alone in the coat room with the photograph of the daughter she'd lost and the ghost of the daughter she'd never been able to see. I didn't see my mother collapse into the small chair by the door behind me, her carefully composed facade finally shattering in private. I didn't see Robert standing in the shadows of the hallway having followed us and heard everything, his face stricken with something that looked like delayed understanding. But someone else had been listening all along. I left the mansion that night and drove back to my hotel, emotionally exhausted, but strangely lighter, as if naming the truth had released some weight I'd been carrying since childhood. I slept better than I had in weeks and woke late on Christmas morning to weak winter sunlight filtering through the hotel curtains. I ordered room service, answered some work emails, and tried to decide whether to fly back to San Francisco that day or stay through the weekend. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't piece together until days later, when the evidence began to surface, was what was happening 12 miles away in my parents' mansion, while I drank mediocre hotel coffee and contemplated my next move. My father had a standing tea time every Christmas morning at his country club, a tradition he'd maintained for 20 years, regardless of weather or family obligations. The house would have been quiet that morning, the party debris cleared away by staff, the elegant facade restored. My mother would have been, in her silk robe, probably nursing a headache and wounded pride in equal measure. And Robert, who usually spent Christmas morning with his girlfriend's family, had apparently decided to stay. I learnt this later from a source I never expected. But In the moment, I was oblivious to the conversation taking place in my father's study, that wood-panelled room that smelled of old leather and older money. Robert told me later, months after everything had played out, that he'd found our mother sitting at father's desk, staring at nothing. The photograph of Sarah was in her hands. He'd started to leave to give her privacy with her grief, but she'd called him back. "Close the door," she'd said. What followed was a conversation I reconstructed from multiple sources, Robert's eventual confession, some documents that would later surface, and my own investigation, once I realised what they'd done. My mother had looked up at Robert with red-rimmed eyes that held more rage than sorrow. "We need to know how she got that money," she'd said, her voice low and sharp. "Private jets, a company with 200 employees. This doesn't add up. Something's not right." Robert had apparently hesitated. He'd just heard the conversation in the coat room, had learned about Sarah, had begun to understand the architecture of our family's dysfunction. But he was also his mother's son, trained in loyalty to the family name above all else. "What are you suggesting?" he'd asked. "I'm suggesting that nobody builds that kind of wealth that quickly without cutting corners. Tax evasion, fraudulent investors, corporate espionage. There are a dozen ways she could have financed that company illegally." My mother had stood pacing the study. "You're an attorney. You know people who can dig into these things." "You want me to investigate Caroline? I want you to find the truth. If she's built this empire legitimately, fine, we'll know. But if there's anything questionable, anything that doesn't hold up under scrutiny, we report it to the IRS, the SEC, whoever needs to know." Robert had been quiet for a long moment. Then, and this is the part that would haunt him later, he'd nodded. "I know a private investigator, former FBI. Very discreet. He specialises in financial investigations. Hire him." "Mum, if Caroline finds out." "She won't. And even if she does, what's she going to do? She's the one who flew a jet over our party. She's the one who caused a scene. We're simply exercising due diligence, protecting the family's reputation. If she has nothing to hide, she has nothing to worry about." The logic was twisted, but compelling, wrapped in the language of protection and propriety that had governed our family for generations. Robert had pulled out his phone and made the calls, right there speaking to someone named Mitchell Harding, explaining that they needed a thorough financial investigation of an aerospace company and its CEO. Surveillance, if necessary. Public record searches, employment verification, corporate filings, bank records if he could access them legally. "We're looking for any irregularities," Robert had said. "Tax issues, investor fraud, anything that doesn't add up." They'd agreed on a price that made Robert wince, but that my mother had approved without hesitation. Harding would start immediately, would have preliminary findings within a week, complete report within 2 weeks. "I want to know everything," my mother had said after Robert hung up. How she got the initial capital, where the money's coming from, whether she's really as successful as she claims, or if this is all smoke and mirrors. What neither of them knew was that my father had come home early from golf, that he'd stood in the hallway outside the study, with his hand on the doorknob, listening to his wife and son plot against his daughter. He'd heard everything. The investigation, the hope of finding evidence of wrongdoing, the plan to report me to federal authorities if they found anything questionable. Robert told me later that he'd heard footsteps in the hall after they'd finished, that he'd opened the study door to find it empty, but had the distinct feeling someone had been there. My father never admitted to overhearing that conversation, but his actions in the coming weeks would suggest he knew exactly what was happening, and true to form, chose silence over intervention. The investigator started work that afternoon, Christmas Day, pulling public records and building a profile of my company and my finances. He was thorough and experienced, and he knew how to dig without leaving obvious traces. By December 28th, 3 days later, I would notice I was being followed. I stayed in Connecticut through the day after Christmas meeting with a few business contacts on the East Coast and giving myself time to process everything that had happened at the party. On December 26th, I flew back to San Francisco and tried to return to normal life, though I found myself replaying the conversation in the coat room, seeing my mother's face when I showed her Sarah's photograph, hearing the crack in her voice when she told me I didn't understand. The first time I noticed the silver sedan was on December 27th, the day after I returned. I'd gone to lunch at a small Vietnamese restaurant near my office, one of my regular spots where they knew my order and let me sit in the back corner with my laptop. When I left, I saw the car parked across the street, a newer model Chevy with tinted windows. A man sat in the driver's seat looking at his phone. Nothing remarkable, nothing that would normally catch my attention, except that when I glanced back after walking half a block, the car pulled out and began driving in the same direction I was walking. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was a public street, lots of silver sedans in San Francisco. But on December 28th, I saw it again. I'd stopped at a coffee shop near my hotel, and there it was, parked in a loading zone with the same driver behind the wheel. This time, I got a better look at him, middle-aged, professional-looking, the kind of generic appearance that was designed to be forgettable. He wasn't watching me directly, but I'd learned over the years to recognise when someone was trying too hard to appear casual. That afternoon, I stopped by the office to sign some documents and check on a prototype issue that had come up. My assistant Jennifer, a sharp woman in her late 20s who'd been with me for 3 years, knocked on my office door with an odd expression. "Caroline, I need to tell you something," she said, closing the door behind her. "Someone called this morning asking about your travel schedule. Said he was a journalist doing a profile piece on women in aerospace." I set down my pen. "Did you give him any information?" "No, it fell off. He was asking very specific questions about when you'd be in the office, whether you travelled frequently, who handled your calendar. I told him all media requests go through our PR department and hung up." She hesitated. But he called back an hour later and tried the same thing with Mark in accounting, asking about the company's financial structure. My pulse quickened, though I kept my expression neutral. "Thank you for telling me. Forward me any contact information he left." After Jennifer left, I sat at my desk and pulled up the contact information for James Chen, my head of security. James was former FBI someone I'd hired 2 years ago, when the company started attracting enough attention that corporate espionage became a real concern. He was methodical, discreet, and perhaps most importantly, paranoid in all the right ways. He answered on the second ring. "Caroline, what's wrong? I need you to do something for me, and I need you to be subtle about it." I described the silver sedan, gave him the license plate number I'd managed to memorize that morning. "Find out who owns it and whether I'm actually being followed or if I'm losing my mind." "You're not losing your mind," he said immediately. "I'll call you back in an hour." He called back in 45 minutes. "The car is registered to Harding Investigations, a private investigation firm based in Hartford, Connecticut. They specialize in financial investigations, corporate due diligence, and surveillance work. The driver is Mitchell Harding, owner and operator, former FBI White-Collar Crimes Division." Connecticut. My hand tightened on the phone. "Can you trace who hired him?" "Give me until tomorrow." I barely slept that night. I kept thinking about my mother's face at the party, the rage barely contained beneath her composed exterior, about Robert's toast, that casual cruelty disguised as sibling rivalry, about the conversation in the coat room, and how I'd walked away thinking maybe I'd finally been heard, finally been seen, when instead I'd apparently triggered something worse than dismissal. James called me at 9 the next morning, December 29th. I've got phone records showing multiple calls between Harding Investigations and a law office in Hartford, Whitmore and Associates. Robert's firm. The confirmation hit me like a physical blow. It was one thing to suspect, another to know with certainty. My family wasn't just rejecting me anymore. They were actively investigating me, looking for evidence to destroy what I'd built. "There's more," James continued, Harding has been pulling public records on Aquila Air, corporate filings, tax documents, business licenses. He's also made calls to 3 of our suppliers posing as a potential client doing due diligence. And he tried to access your personal bank records, though he was blocked by the bank's security protocols. And they're looking for dirt, I said quietly. They're looking for anything that might suggest financial impropriety, tax evasion, investor fraud, regulatory violations. This is a professional hit job, Caroline. Whoever hired him wants to find evidence they can use against you, probably to report to federal authorities. I stood at my office window, looking out over San Francisco Bay, and felt something cold settle in my chest. My mother and brother weren't content with excluding me from their lives. They wanted to dismantle mine. "What do you want me to do?" James asked. "I can make it very uncomfortable for him to continue surveillance. Maybe have a friendly conversation about harassment laws." "No," I said. "Don't confront him. Don't do anything that tips them off that we know. Let him dig." "Caroline, I've built this company legitimately, James. Every dollar accounted for, every tax form filed correctly, every regulation followed to the letter. I've been terrified of making mistakes my entire career because I knew I'd never get the benefit of the doubt." I turned away from the window. "Let them investigate. They won't find anything because there's nothing to find. I've always played by the rules." I hung up and immediately called out my corporate attorney, a woman named Sandra Mills, who'd helped me navigate everything from incorporation to patent law. I explained the situation in clinical detail, the family conflict, the surveillance, the investigation. They're hoping to find evidence of fraud or tax evasion they can report to the IRS or SEC, I said. But we both know there's nothing to find. My question is, what do we do about it? "We could sue for harassment," Sandra said, "or get a restraining order if the surveillance continues." "That's playing defense," I said, "and I'm done playing defense." There was a pause. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that if they want to investigate me, they're going to find out exactly how successful I've become. Every legal business dealing, every properly filed tax return, every ethically acquired contract. And when they realise there's no scandal to uncover, no crime to report, they're going to have to face what they've been avoiding, that I built something real without their help or approval." I felt something shift inside me, a decision crystallising. But playing defence wasn't enough anymore. It was time for offence. Over the next 2 weeks, James and I built a comprehensive file. Every instance of surveillance documented with timestamps and photographs. Every phone call Harding made to my suppliers and employees recorded and transcribed. Every public record he pulled, traced and logged. The phone records showing dozens of calls between his firm and Robert's law office. Even the attempted bank access, which had triggered security alerts that were now part of our evidence. Sandra advised me to file a harassment suit immediately. James suggested we go to the media, turn this into a story about a successful woman being targeted by her wealthy family. But I had a different plan, one that would require waiting for exactly the right moment. That moment came on January 15th, when I received an email invitation to my father's birthday dinner. It would be smaller than the Christmas party, more intimate. Just family and a few close friends, 20 people at most. My mother had sent the invitation herself this time, probably feeling obligated after the scene at Christmas, though her message was brief to the point of coldness. "Your father would like you to attend his birthday celebration, January 15th, 7 p.m. I RSVP'd yes within the hour. I flew to Connecticut that afternoon, carrying only a leather messenger bag and a small overnight case. The bag contained a single folder organised with the methodical precision I'd learned in engineering school. Evidence arranged chronologically, each piece building on the last, telling a story that couldn't be denied or dismissed. I arrived at the mansion at precisely 7 p.m. The party was already underway in the dining room, more subdued than Christmas, more family than spectacle. My mother stood at the head of the table directing seating arrangements. Robert was there with his girlfriend, a polished blonde named Amanda who worked in marketing. My father sat in his usual spot, looking older and more tired than I remembered from 3 weeks ago. A handful of other guests filled out the table, my father's law partner and his wife, a couple who'd been family friends for decades. My Aunt Margaret, who'd been at the auxiliary table on Christmas Eve. When I walked in, conversation stuttered and died. My mother's smile froze in place. "Caroline," she said with admirable composure, "how good of you to come." "I wouldn't miss Father's birthday," I said pleasantly, taking the seat that had been set for me. Interestingly, it was at the main table this time, though, at the far end, as distant from my parents as the seating chart allowed. Dinner proceeded with careful small talk. My father's law partner told stories about cases they'd won together. Amanda asked polite questions about everyone's holiday plans. My mother orchestrated the conversation like a conductor, steering away from anything controversial, keeping everything light and safe. I participated minimally, responded when spoken to, and waited. Dessert was being served when I finally spoke up. "Before we sing Happy Birthday," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the momentary quiet, "I have a gift for Dad, something I think everyone here should see." I pulled the leather folder from my bag and set it on the table in front of me. My mother's eyes locked onto it with something that looked like fear. Robert's hand holding a coffee cup went very still. "The truth is, a gift, don't you think?" I opened the folder carefully, making sure everyone at the table could see I was handling documents, official-looking papers with letterheads and timestamps, especially when it's been hiding in the shadows. "Caroline," my mother said, her voice tight with warning, "this is neither the time nor the place for what, Mother? For honesty." I pulled out the first set of documents. On December 25th, someone hired a private investigator named Mitchell Harding to surveil me, to follow me, to dig through my company's finances, looking for evidence of fraud or tax evasion. The table went completely silent. My father's law partner set down his fork. Amanda looked between Robert and me with dawning comprehension. Phone records show that Mr. Harding made 47 calls to Whitmore and Associates between December the 25th and January 10th. I slid the phone records across the table. "That's Robert's law firm for anyone who doesn't know." Robert's face drained of colour. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The investigator followed me for 2 weeks, called my employees pretending to be a journalist, contacted my suppliers claiming to be a potential client, even tried to access my personal bank records, which fortunately triggered security protocols. I laid out each piece of evidence methodically, building the case the way I'd learned to present engineering proposals. All of this was done with the intention of finding something illegal, something they could report to federal authorities to destroy my business and my reputation. "This is absurd," my mother said, but her voice shook. "We were simply what?" I met her eyes. "Simply trying to protect the family reputation, simply exercising due diligence, or simply refusing to accept that I might have actually succeeded without your help or approval." My father, who had been staring at the documents spread across the table, finally looked up. His face had gone pale, his eyes moving between my mother and Robert. "You did what?" His voice was quiet, but carried a weight I'd never heard before. "You hired someone to investigate your daughter, to try to find evidence to have her arrested." It was the first time in my entire life I'd heard my father challenge my mother in front of other people. The first time he'd chosen to speak rather than retreat into silence. "Richard, you don't understand," my mother started, but he held up his hand. "No, Patricia, I think I finally do understand." He looked at me, and I saw something in his expression that might have been regret or shame, or both. "I'm sorry, Caroline. I'm so very sorry." The words hung in the air between us, insufficient but sincere. "I appreciate that," I said quietly. Then I pulled out one more document, the one I'd been saving. But I wasn't finished yet, because they'd made one more mistake I was about to reveal. I reached into the folder and pulled out a contract, several pages stapled together, with official-looking letterhead and dense legal language. I placed it on the table where everyone could see it, handling it carefully, as if it were evidence in a courtroom, which, in a sense, it was. 3 days ago, I said, keeping my voice level and clear, a man named David Brennan came to my office in San Francisco. He claimed to be my original investor from 2019, the one who provided the initial capital that allowed me to start Aquila Air. He said there had been a misunderstanding about the terms of our agreement. I watched my mother's hands grip the edge of the table, her knuckles going white. Mr. Brennan presented this contract, allegedly signed by both of us 6 years ago. According to this document, he's entitled to 30% equity in my company, plus $5 million in back payments for services rendered. I paused, letting that sink in. That would effectively give him control of Aquila Air and bankrupt the company in the process. Robert leaned forward, his lawyer instincts apparently overriding his guilt. If there's a legitimate contract, there isn't, I cut him off, because this signature is forged. I pointed to the signature line at the bottom of the contract, where someone had carefully copied my name in flowing script. Look at it carefully. It's written right-handed, smooth, confident strokes moving left to right. I held up my left hand, the one wearing my grandfather's watch. I'm left-handed, always have been. Anyone who's ever seen me sign a document knows that my signature slants the opposite direction, that certain letters are formed differently because of the angle of my hand. My father's law partner, a man who'd been practicing for 40 years, leaned forward to examine the signature. She's right, he said quietly. That's not a left-handed signature. But let's say someone argued that I sometimes sign right-handed, or that the angle was just different that day, I continued. The contract is dated March 15th, 2019, a very specific date. I pulled out another document, this one with the official seal of the United States Department of State. These is on my passport records. On March 15th, 2019, I was in Shanghai, China, meeting with potential suppliers for aircraft components. I have entry stamps, exit stamps, hotel receipts, and photographs with timestamps. I laid the passport records on top of the forged contract. I was literally on the other side of the world when this contract was allegedly signed in San Francisco. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the catering staff who'd been quietly clearing plates had stopped moving. Who is this David Brennan? My father asked, his voice hard in a way I'd never heard before. And why would he try to forge a contract? That's the interesting part, I said, and now I did allow myself a small cold smile. David Brennan is a former business associate of Robert's. They worked together on a corporate fraud case 4 years ago. Brennan was the defendant who eventually settled. He's also someone who, according to his financial records, has been struggling significantly since then. I pulled out phone records, the kind that required a court order to obtain, but that my attorney had managed to secure once we had evidence of fraud. Mr. Brennan's phone records show 17 calls to a cell phone number over the past 3 weeks. I slid the records toward my mother. That number belongs to you, Mother. Her face went absolutely still, all expression draining away, as if someone had pulled a plug. There's more, I continued relentlessly. Wire transfers from a personal account at Hartford Savings and Trust, an account opened in December under your maiden name. An account that my father's name isn't on. I looked at my father. Did you know Mother had a separate bank account with over $200,000 in it? My father's expression answered the question. That account shows a wire transfer of $50,000 to David Brennan on January the 5th, with a notation reading consulting services. I let that hang in the air. $50,000 to convince a desperate man to walk into my office and attempt to extort me with a forged contract. The plan was simple. If I paid him to go away quietly, you would claim victory because I'd proven I had something to hide. If I refused, and he sued, the publicity would damage my company's reputation, regardless of whether he won. And if, by some chance, he actually succeeded in proving the contract was legitimate, he'd gain control of my company and presumably share the proceeds with his benefactor. My mother's girlfriend gasped. My father's law partner sat back in his chair, shaking his head in disbelief. Robert looked like he might be sick. The problem, I said, is that Mr. Brennan wasn't particularly bright. When my head of security started asking questions, he panicked. When my attorney offered him immunity in exchange for testimony about who hired him, he took it immediately. I pulled out a sworn affidavit, notarized and official. He's provided a full statement about your involvement, Mother. The calls, the payments, the instructions you gave him about what to say and how to present the forged contract. My father turned to look at his wife, and I saw something break in his expression. Not anger exactly, but a kind of profound disappointment that was somehow worse. You tried to destroy our daughter's company, he said quietly. You hired someone to commit fraud. You could go to prison for this, Patricia. I was protecting this family, my mother said, but her voice had lost all its authority. She sounded hollow, desperate. She came here with her jet and her money and humiliated us in front of everyone we know. She dredged up Sarah's death and threw it in my face. She survived, my father interrupted, his voice sharp. She survived the accident that killed Sarah. She survived a childhood where her own mother couldn't bear to look at her. She survived being forgotten and dismissed and excluded from her own family. And she built something extraordinary despite all of it. He stood up slowly. The only people who humiliated this family are sitting at this table. And I'm ashamed to say I'm one of them. My mother stood slowly, her chair scraping against the floor, and for the first time in my life, I saw her completely unmasked. My mother's face was a portrait of raw emotion I'd never seen before. Fear, rage, humiliation, and something that might have been grief all fought for dominance. Her carefully constructed mask, the one she'd worn for decades in front of society, had finally cracked wide open. She took a step backward, away from the table, as if physical distance might somehow erase what had just been revealed. I won't sit here and be interrogated like a criminal in my own home. Sit down, Mother. My voice came out quiet, but edged with steel I didn't know I possessed. We're not done. Something in my tone stopped her. Perhaps it was the realization that I held all the cards now that running would only make things worse. She sank back into her chair slowly, her movements stiff and mechanical. There's one more thing everyone should know, I said, pulling out a final set of documents. When my attorney started investigating David Brennan, we discovered he had a business partner, someone who helped him develop the strategy for the lawsuit, who provided inside information about my company that only someone with connections could have accessed. Robert closed his eyes, his jaw clenched. That partner was a competitor of mine, Gregory Marshall, of Marshall Aviation, a man whose company has been losing contracts to Aquila Air for the past 2 years. I laid out printed emails exchanges between my mother and Marshall. Mother reached out to him in early January, shortly after hiring the private investigator. She offered him information about my business operations in exchange for his help in destroying my company's reputation. My father's law partner muttered something under his breath that sounded like a prayer or a curse. Mr. Marshall was very cooperative once my attorney explained the potential consequences of conspiracy to commit fraud. He provided all email correspondence, including one particularly illuminating exchange where Mother wrote, and I, quote, "If we can't prove she's a criminal, we can at least make sure everyone thinks she is. A lawsuit, even a baseless one, will destroy her credibility." The woman sitting next to my mother, a friend of 40 years, pushed her chair back slightly, creating visible distance. "My attorney is here tonight, actually," I said. Sandra had been waiting in the entrance hall as planned, and At my nod, she walked into the dining room, her professional presence adding weight to everything I'd presented. "Sandra, would you explain the legal implications?" Sandra set her briefcase on the side table and addressed the room with the clinical precision of someone who'd spent 20 years in corporate law. "Mrs. Knight could face criminal charges for conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted extortion and wire fraud for the financial transactions. Given the interstate nature of the crimes and the amounts involved, these are federal offences. If convicted, she could face 3 to 5 years in federal prison and substantial fines." My mother made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob. "However," Sandra continued, "my client has decided not to press criminal charges at this time." Relief flooded my mother's face for just a moment before I spoke again. "Not because you deserve mercy," I said, meeting her eyes, "but because I'm not you. I don't destroy people even when they try to destroy me. I build things, I create value, I solve problems." I paused, letting that sink in. "But I'm also not naive enough to leave myself unprotected." I pulled out one final document, placing it in front of my mother. "This is a full confession detailing everything you've done. The investigation, the attempted fraud, the conspiracy with Marshall. You're going to sign it, and I'm going to keep it sealed in my attorney's office. And if I refuse," her voice was barely a whisper, "then Sandra files criminal charges tomorrow morning, and you'll be arrested by federal agents probably within 48 hours. I kept my tone matter-of-fact. "Your choice." She stared at the document, her hand trembling as she reached for the pen Sandra offered. "There's more," I said. "You're going to resign from every social board you're on, the charity foundation, the country club committee, the historical society, all of it, effective immediately. You can't ask me to—" "I'm not asking." My voice remained steady. "Those positions give you power over people's reputations, their social standing, their inclusion in the community. You've proven you'll abuse that power to hurt people who displease you. I won't let you keep it." My father, who had been silent through all of this, finally spoke. "Sign it, Patricia, and resign. It's the least you can do." She signed the confession with a shaking hand, her signature barely legible. Sandra witnessed it, dated it, and placed it in her briefcase. "If you ever come after me again, in any way," I said quietly, "that confession becomes public record. Every newspaper, every social media platform, every person in your precious social circle will know exactly what you tried to do." I stood collecting my folder and my bag. The guests remained frozen witnesses to the complete dissolution of the Knight family's carefully maintained image. "Happy birthday, Dad," I said, and walked out of the dining room. The next morning, Mother's resignation letters hit the desks of 4 different organisations within an hour of each other. By noon, the gossip networks of Connecticut high society were ablaze with speculation. By evening, the whispers had become pointed questions. But the real consequences were just beginning. I flew back to San Francisco the morning after my father's birthday dinner and tried to return to normal life, though I found myself checking my phone compulsively for news from Connecticut. The fallout came in waves, each one more severe than the last. The charity board accepted my mother's resignation within 24 hours, citing personal reasons in their official statement, though I heard through connections that the real discussion had been considerably less polite. When other board members learned why she'd resigned when they understood what she'd tried to do to her own daughter, the whispers began. In the world my mother inhabited, reputation was currency, and hers had just been devalued catastrophically. The country club was slower to act, bound by bylaws and procedures, but within a week they'd initiated a membership review that everyone understood was a precursor to asking her to resign. Her tennis partners stopped returning calls. Her bridge club suddenly had no room at their regular table. The women she'd lunched with for 30 years were mysteriously unavailable whenever she suggested getting together. I knew all this because people talked, and in the interconnected world of East Coast society, news travelled fast. I also knew it because my father called me on January 23rd, 8 days after the dinner. "She's not handling it well," he said without preamble. "She barely leaves her room. She's not eating." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and meant it. I'd wanted accountability, not destruction. The Hendersons cancelled their invitation to the spring gala. The Washingtons uninvited her from their daughter's wedding. Even her own sister hasn't called. He paused. "This is killing her, Caroline. More effectively than any prison sentence would have." "She tried to have me arrested for fraud I didn't commit," I said quietly. "She hired someone to forge documents and extort me. What did she think would happen?" I know what she did was unforgivable." His voice cracked slightly. "But she's still my wife. And despite everything, she's your mother." "Is she?" The question came out before I could stop it. "Because mothers protect their children. They celebrate their successes. They show up for graduations and care when their daughters are struggling. What she did was try to destroy me because she couldn't accept that I'd succeeded without her approval." The line was quiet for a long moment. "You're right, and I enabled it by staying silent for 35 years. I'm just as guilty as she is." "Yes," I agreed. "You are." 2 days later, I called again. "I need to see you, to talk in person. Would you meet me somewhere, just the two of us?" We met at a quiet restaurant in Manhattan Neutral Ground. He looked older than I remembered, the lines in his face deeper, his movements slower. We ordered coffee. Neither of us drank and sat in uncomfortable silence until he finally spoke. "You could have destroyed us," he said. "Pressed charges, gone to the media, ruined our reputations completely. Why didn't you?" I thought about that question when I'd asked myself repeatedly over the past 2 weeks. "Because then I'd be like her, Iya," I said finally. "And I spent 35 years proving I'm not. I don't destroy people even when they deserve it. I just refuse to let them destroy me." He nodded slowly, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "For what it's worth, I'm proud of you. I should have said it decades ago, but I'm saying it now. What you've built, who you've become, it's extraordinary." "Thank you," I said. "But you should know I didn't do it for your pride. I did it for mine." Robert faced his own consequences. His law firm, Whitmore and Associates, initiated an ethics review when the managing partners learned of his involvement in hiring the investigator and his connection to David Brennan. They put him on 6 months probation, assigned a senior partner to oversee all his cases, and made it clear that one more misstep would mean termination. 2 of his major clients' corporations with strict compliance requirements quietly moved their business to other firms. He called me once during those 2 weeks. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough, "for all of it. The investigation, the comments at the party, everything." "I know," I said, because I did know. Robert had been trapped in his own cage, the golden child who could never step out of line, never disappoint, never be anything less than perfect. "I don't expect forgiveness," he continued. "I just wanted you to know that I finally understand what they did to you, what I helped them do." The media attention came toward the end of January. My PR team, after consultation with me, leaked a carefully edited version of the story to a technology journalist who'd been following Aquila Air's growth. The article ran on January 28th. "Tech CEO exposes family sabotage. A story of resilience and success despite the odds." It focused on my achievements, my company's innovations, and included just enough detail about my family's actions to paint a clear picture without being vindictive. The response was overwhelming. Messages of support flooded my social media. Other women in business reached out to share their own stories of family members who tried to undermine their success. The narrative had shifted completely. I was no longer the invisible daughter, but the survivor who'd built an empire despite extraordinary obstacles. I should have felt triumphant. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I mostly felt tired. I thought it was over. The confrontation complete, the consequences delivered, the boundaries established. I thought I could finally move forward and leave the past behind. But on January 30th, Martha called from a hospital in Connecticut, her voice weak and thin. "Child," she said, "I need to see you. There are things you need to know before I go." I thought it was over, but someone was dying and had one last truth to tell. I caught the first flight I could get, arriving at Hartford Hospital early the next morning. Martha was in a private room on the cardiac floor machines, beeping softly around her bed. She looked impossibly small against the white sheets, her brown skin ashen, her breathing laboured even with the oxygen tube under her nose. When she saw me in the doorway, her eyes filled with tears. "There's my girl," she whispered. I pulled a chair close to her bedside and took her hand, feeling how fragile it had become, all bone and papery skin. "I'm here, Martha. I'm here." "I don't have long, child, she said, and the certainty in her voice told me she'd already made peace with dying. "The doctors gave me days, maybe a week, but there are things you need to know before I go, things I've kept to myself too long." "You don't have to ask." "Yes, I do." She squeezed my hand with surprising strength. "You remember when you started your company, when you'd gone through all those rejections, when you were sleeping on that couch in the garage?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. "You told me about investor number 48, the one who finally said yes, the one who gave you $200,000 when you only had $347 left to your name." "I remember. A Knight Investments, LLC. I never knew who was behind it." Martha's smile was sad and knowing. "That was your father, Caroline." The words didn't make sense at first. I stared at her, waiting for clarification, for context that would make the impossible possible. "Your father used a shell company to hide the investment from your mother. He knew she'd never approve, knew she'd find some way to stop him." Martha's breathing grew more laboured, and she paused to gather strength. "He also knew his law firm had ethics rules about family investments, conflicts of interest. He could have been disbarred if anyone found out. But he did it anyway. He believed in you when you couldn't believe in yourself." I felt something crack open in my chest, a pain that was also somehow relief. "He knew, all this time, he knew I'd make it. He kept every article about your company, every mention in the trade journals. He has them in a locked drawer in his study, has had them for years." Martha coughed, a wet, rattling sound. "He failed you in so many ways, child, but in that one moment, when it mattered most, he chose you over his own safety." I sat there holding her hand, trying to reconcile the father who'd stayed silent through decades of my mother's cruelty with the father who'd risked everything to give me that chance. "There's more," Martha said. "Do you remember when your grandfather died? You were 25, working at Boeing. Mother told me not to come to the funeral, said it would be too painful for everyone, that I should just stay in Seattle and remember him my own way. Robert called me after he heard what she'd said. He was furious, said it wasn't right, that you deserved to say goodbye." Martha's eyes closed briefly. "He sent me $5,000 through a wire transfer, told me to buy you a plane ticket to bring you home for the funeral, even if your mother had said no." My breath caught. "Robert did that?" "I never gave you the money. I knew you'd refuse it. Out of pride, knew you'd be hurt that he'd sent it through me instead of calling himself. So I kept it, used it to send you flowers on your birthdays, small gifts at Christmas, the things your parents never remembered." She looked at me with ancient eyes. "He tried Caroline? In his own broken way, he tried?" We sat in silence for a while, the only sound the steady beep of monitors and her laboured breathing. I thought about all the years I'd spent believing I was completely alone, not knowing that there had been small acts of faith, quiet gestures of belief, hidden in the shadows. "Why didn't you tell me before?" I finally asked. "Because I knew you needed to stand on your own first. to know in your bones that you'd succeeded because you were brilliant and determined, not because someone secretly helped you. She squeezed my hand again. You were always meant to fly, sweet girl. I just wish I could see how high you'll go. I stayed with her through the day and into the evening. We talked about my childhood, about the model airplane I'd built with my grandfather, about the first time she'd found me crying in the kitchen after yet another forgotten birthday. She told me about her own daughter, who died young from cancer, and how I'd filled some of that emptiness in her heart. As night fell and visiting hours ended, I started to stand, but she held on to my hand. "Stay," she whispered. "Please, I don't want to be alone." So I stayed, pulling the chair as close as it would go, holding her hand through the dark hours. Her breathing grew shallower as the night progressed, each breath a little more laboured than the last. Just before dawn on February 1st, she opened her eyes one last time and looked at me with perfect clarity. "You were always meant to fly," she whispered, echoing what she'd said earlier. "I just wish I could see how high." "You already have," I told her, tears streaming down my face. "You already have, Martha." She smiled, peaceful and content, and closed her eyes. 3 breaths later, the monitor's steady beep became a single, sustained tone. Martha's funeral was held 3 days later at a small Baptist church in Hartford. At Martha's funeral 3 days later, someone unexpected stepped forward to speak. Robert stood from his seat in the 3rd row and walked to the front of the church. He hadn't told anyone he planned to speak, hadn't cleared it with the pastor or asked permission. He simply stood and moved forward with the kind of quiet determination I'd only seen in courtrooms when he knew he had to say something difficult. He stood at the pulpit for a long moment, looking out at the small congregation. My parents sat stiffly in the front row, my mother's face hidden behind a black veil, my father staring at his hands. Martha's church friends filled the other pews, women who'd known her for decades, who'd prayed with her and laughed with her and were now mourning her loss. "I'm Robert Knight," he began, his voice steady but stripped of its usual courtroom confidence. "Martha worked for my family for 40 years, but that's not why I'm standing here." He gripped the edges of the pulpit, his knuckles white. "I'm standing here because Martha was more family to us than we deserved. She was more of a mother to my sister Caroline than our own mother ever was, and she saw Caroline's worth when the rest of us were too blind, too proud, or too broken to see it." The church was absolutely silent. My mother's head came up slightly, though her face remained hidden. "Martha called me once a year, every year, on Caroline's birthday," Robert continued. "She'd ask if I'd reached out to my sister, if I'd sent her a card or made a call or acknowledged her in any way, and every year I'd make excuses. I'd say I was busy with work, that the family situation was complicated, that maybe next year would be better." His voice cracked slightly. "And every year Martha would say the same thing. She'd say, 'That girl is doing something remarkable out there and she's doing it all alone. She shouldn't have to be alone.' And then she'd hang up, disappointed but not surprised." I felt tears sliding down my face, unable to stop them. "I will carry that shame forever," Robert said, looking directly at me now. "The shame of choosing comfort over courage, of choosing my parents' approval over defending someone who needed defending, of being too cowardly to love my sister the way Martha did, freely and without condition." He stepped away from the pulpit, his part finished, and walked back to his seat. The pastor rose to continue the service, but I barely heard the rest of it. I was too focused on processing what Robert had said, the public acknowledgement of failure, the raw honesty that must have cost him dearly in front of our parents. After the service, people gathered in the church hall for coffee and sandwiches, sharing stories about Martha. I stood in the corner, emotionally exhausted, when Robert approached. He'd removed his suit jacket, loosened his tie, and looked as drained as I felt. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. "Alone." We walked outside into the cold February afternoon, finding a bench in the church's small garden. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Robert turned to face me. "I tried to help when you were 16, he said, "when you left home after that fight with Mum about college. I wanted to call you to make sure you were okay, but Mum forbade it. She said you needed to learn that actions have consequences, that running away wouldn't solve anything." "I remember," I said softly. "I waited for someone to call, to check on me. No one ever did. I chose wrong." His voice was raw with regret. "I chose their approval over defending you. I told myself I was just keeping the peace, that getting involved would make things worse. But really, I was just scared of losing my position as the good son." "The golden child," I said without bitterness, just stating a fact. "The golden child," he agreed, "but also a prisoner. You had the freedom to fail, Caroline, and that's what made you free to succeed. I had to be perfect every single time. One mistake and I'd lose everything I'd built my identity around." He looked down at his hands. "Martha told me once that you were braver than me because you chose uncertainty over safety. She was right. I've spent my whole life in a cage I built myself, following rules that someone else made, trying to earn love that should have been freely given." "We both lost something," I said after a moment. "You lost your authenticity. I lost my family. Neither of us got what we deserved." "No," he agreed. "We didn't." We sat in silence for a while, two people who'd grown up in the same house but had lived completely different childhoods. Then Robert said something that surprised me. "I called Martha every year on your birthday because I couldn't call you directly. I was too ashamed, too scared of what you'd say, of having to face what I'd failed to do. So I called her instead and asked if you were okay, if you were happy, if you needed anything." "She never told me," I said. "I asked her not to. I didn't want it to seem like I was trying to get credit for caring when I'd done nothing to show it." He looked at me, finally, his eyes red-rimmed. "But I did care, Caroline. I do care. I just didn't know how to show it without losing everything else." Something in me softened, not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. Robert had been damaged by our family too, just differently. His cage had been gilded, but it was still a cage. "Maybe we can start again," I said quietly. "Not pretend the past didn't happen, but start building something new from here." For the first time in decades, I hugged my brother. He held on tightly and I felt him shake with silent sobs against my shoulder. When we finally pulled apart, he wiped his eyes and gave me a sad smile. "Thank you for giving me a chance I don't deserve." "We all deserve a chance to be better than we were," I said. But as we walked back toward the church hall, I knew there was one ghost that remained, one relationship that couldn't be fixed with understanding and tears. The hardest one. I'd planned to fly back to San Francisco on February 6th to put Connecticut and all its ghosts behind me. I'd reconciled what could be reconciled, mourned what needed to be mourned, and set boundaries that would protect me going forward. I thought I was done. Then, on the evening of February 5th, there was a knock on my hotel room door. I opened it to find my mother standing in the hallway, and for a moment I barely recognised her. She wore no makeup, her face bare and showing every one of her 63 years. Her hair, usually styled with precision, was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore jeans and a sweater clothes I'd never seen her in, had never imagined she owned. Her hands were shaking. "May I come in?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. I stepped aside, letting her enter. She moved slowly, as if unsure of her welcome, and sat in the chair by the window without being invited. I remained standing, keeping distance between us. "I need to say something before you leave Connecticut forever," she said, staring at her hands. "And I need to say it without your father here, without Robert, without anyone who might stop me or soften what needs to be said." I waited, saying nothing. "I see Sarah every time I look at you." The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them in for so long they'd built up pressure. The daughter I held while she died. The daughter I lost. I see her smile in yours. I see her eyes in your face. I see her determination in everything you do. Her hands twisted in her lap, gripping each other so tightly her knuckles went white. And I've spent 35 years punishing you for surviving when she didn't. Not because you did anything wrong, not because you're not worthy of love, but because every time I looked at you, I had to remember that day, the truck, the impact, her body in my arms, and you crying in your car seat, alive and whole, while she was dying. Tears streamed down her face, now no attempt to wipe them away or hide them. I hate myself for it, she whispered. I hate myself for being so broken that I couldn't love the daughter I had because I was drowning in grief for the daughter I lost. I hate myself for every birthday I forgot, every graduation I missed, every achievement I dismissed. I hate myself for what I tried to do to your company, for how far I went in trying to tear you down when I should have been building you up. I walked to my overnight bag and pulled out 3 journals worn notebooks I'd kept since childhood. I'd retrieved them from the house days ago, not sure why I'd brought them with me, but feeling like I needed them. I want to show you something, I said, sitting on the edge of the bed. I opened the first journal dated when I was 12 years old. This is what I wrote on my 13th birthday. Why don't they love me? What did I do wrong? If I'm smarter, if I'm better, if I'm perfect, will they finally see me? My mother's face crumpled. I opened the second journal from my MIT years. This is from when I was 22, the day I graduated summa cum laude. I'll prove my worth. I'll be so successful, they'll have to acknowledge me. I'll earn their love through achievement. I opened the third journal, recent entries from this past year. And this is from last month. I don't need anyone to see me anymore. I see myself. I know my worth. It doesn't require their validation. I set the journals on the bed between us. Do you see the journey, Mum, from a 12-year-old who thought she was defective to a young adult who thought she could earn love through performance, to a woman who finally understands that some people are too broken to give what you need from them? I'm so sorry, she sobbed. I'm so sorry. I was always visible, I said, and my voice was steady, now certain. Just not to you. Martha saw me. Grandfather saw me. My employees see me. My clients see me. The people who mattered saw me. I stopped waiting for your eyes to open. My mother looked up at me, mascara-less eyes red and swollen. Can you ever forgive me? The question hung in the air between us, heavy with 35 years of pain and hope and damage. I thought about Sarah, the 7-year-old I'd never met, but who'd shaped my entire existence. I thought about my mother holding her dying daughter, making a choice about car seats that would haunt her forever. I thought about trauma and grief and how pain unprocessed and unhealed spreads like poison through generations. And my answer surprised us both. I looked at my mother, at this woman who'd given me life but had never been able to see it, and felt something shift inside me. Not the rush of relief I'd expected if this moment ever came. Not the warmth of reconciliation or the satisfaction of vindication. Just a quiet settling, like a door closing softly on a room I'd been trying to enter for 35 years. Yes, I said finally, I forgive you. Her face transformed with hope, relief flooding her features. She started to stand, perhaps to embrace me, but I held up my hand. But not for the reasons you think. I continued, my voice gentle but firm. I forgive you for me, so I can let go and sleep at night. So I can stop carrying the weight of your grief and your guilt and your inability to heal. Not for us. Because some things can't be undone, Mum. Forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. The hope in her face flickered confusion, replacing it. I don't understand. If you forgive me, forgiveness is releasing you from the debt you owe me, I said. It's deciding that I won't let what you did continue to poison my life. It's choosing peace over the exhausting work of staying angry. I leaned forward slightly. But it's not permission to pretend the past didn't happen. It's not an invitation back into my life as if 35 years of damage can be erased with an apology. She sat back down slowly, her hands trembling in her lap. What are you saying? I'm saying that you're released from guilt. You don't have to carry it anymore. You don't have to torture yourself with what you did or didn't do. That's your work to process your healing journey to take. I took a breath, steadying myself. And I'm released from needing your love, from trying to earn something you were never capable of giving, from making myself smaller or bigger or different in hopes that you'd finally see me. But I do see you now, she said desperately. I see what you've built, who you've become. You see my success, Igis, I corrected gently. You see the jet and the company and the achievements. But you still don't see me, Mum. You don't know my favourite food or what makes me laugh or what I dream about when I'm alone. You don't know me because you never asked. And at this point, I'm not sure you're capable of knowing me. Too much time has passed. Too much damage has been done. The truth of it hung between us stark and undeniable. So, what happens now? She asked, her voice small. We can be civil, I said, and I meant it. We can be in the same room at family events without it being warfare. If Robert has children someday, I can be at birthday parties and holidays. We can exchange pleasantries and exist in the same family orbit. But, she prompted, hearing what I wasn't saying, but we can't pretend we're close. We can't act like we have a mother-daughter relationship when we don't. That would be dishonest, and it would dishonour what we both lost. I thought about Sarah, about the ghost that had haunted both our lives. You lost a daughter in that accident. I lost the mother you might have been if you'd had the strength to heal. We can acknowledge those losses without pretending we can fix them. My mother's shoulders sagged and she looked older than I'd ever seen her. That's all I get, civility. That's more than you gave me for 35 years, I said without cruelty, just stating fact. And honestly, it's more than you have a right to expect after trying to destroy my company and have me arrested for fraud. She flinched at the reminder. I could have destroyed you, I continued, and this was important for her to understand. Legally, socially, completely. I had evidence of fraud, conspiracy, attempted extortion. I could have sent you to federal prison. I could have leaked everything to the media, turned you into a cautionary tale. I could have used my resources and connections to ensure you never showed your face in polite society again. Why didn't you? She whispered. Because you were already destroying yourself, I said simply. Your friends abandoned you. Your social standing evaporated. The life you'd built around appearances and status crumbled the moment people saw who you really were beneath the polish. I paused. And because I'm not you. I don't destroy people even when they try to destroy me. My peace is victory enough. That truth settled over us, like snow quiet and complete. I'd won, but not in the way she'd feared. I'd won by refusing to become like her, by choosing healing over revenge, by building a life so full and successful that her approval had become irrelevant. I don't know how to be around you now, she admitted. If we're not going to be close, if we're just going to be civil, I don't know what that looks like. It looks like this, I said. You show up to family events if you're invited. You don't interrogate me about my life or my choices. You don't offer unsolicited advice or criticism. You treat me with the basic courtesy you'd give a distant acquaintance. And in return, I'll do the same. That sounds lonely, she said. It is lonely, I agreed. For both of us, but it's honest. And after a lifetime of pretending, I'll take honest loneliness over fake closeness any day. She stood again, moving toward the door this time, understanding that our conversation had reached its natural end. She paused with her hand on the doorknob. For what it's worth, she said quietly, I do see now what a remarkable person you are. Not just your success, but your character, your strength, your capacity to forgive when you have every right to hate. She turned to look at me one last time. I'm proud of you, Caroline. I know I have no right to be, and I know it doesn't mean anything coming so late. But I am. Thank you, I said, because it cost nothing to be gracious. That means something, even if it can't change what's already happened. She nodded and left the door, closing softly behind her. I sat on the bed for a long time afterwards, staring at the journals I'd shown her at the arc of my life, written in my own hand. From the desperate 12-year-old begging to be loved to the driven 22-year-old trying to earn it to the 35-year-old who'd finally learned she didn't need it. I picked up my phone and texted Robert. I told Mum I forgive her, but I also told her we can't be close. Just wanted you to know in case she calls you. His response came quickly. That took courage. Are you okay? Yeah, I typed back. I actually am. And I realised it was true. The weight I'd been carrying since childhood, that desperate need for maternal love and approval, had lifted, not because I'd gotten what I wanted, but because I'd finally stopped wanting it. I'd released my mother from the impossible task of becoming someone she wasn't, and I'd released myself from the equally impossible task of earning love from someone incapable of giving it. I spent one more night in Connecticut sleeping better than I had in weeks. The next morning, I flew back to San Francisco, back to my company, back to the life I'd built without them. I thought I'd close the chapter on my family, that I'd move forward with the civil distance I'd established. But 3 months later, in May, I did something no one expected. What I did was something Martha would have loved, something that turned all the pain and rejection of my childhood into purpose. I established a scholarship fund with a $10 million endowment designed to support young women from families who'd dismissed or undermined them, who'd been told they weren't smart enough, ambitious enough, or worthy enough to pursue their dreams. I named it the Martha Knight Fund. The legal work took weeks. My attorneys drew up the foundation documents, established the selection criteria, created the application process. We decided to offer full scholarships covering tuition, housing, and living expenses for undergraduate and graduate students in STEM fields. The first year would support 20 scholars. Within 5 years, we hoped to support 100. I reached out to Martha's niece, a woman named Diane, who'd been at the funeral, and asked if she'd be willing to serve as the executive director. She'd been a teacher for 20 years, understood the barriers young women faced, and had loved her aunt deeply. She accepted immediately, tears in her eyes. The launch event was scheduled for early June, exactly 6 months after Martha's death. We rented a beautiful venue in Hartford, close enough to where Martha had lived, that her church community could attend. I invited 200 people, educators, business leaders, former colleagues from Boeing and Aquila Air journalists, and representatives from organisations supporting women in STEM fields. I also sent invitations to my family, a formal card to my parents, a personal note to Robert. I didn't expect them to come, but I wanted them to know about it, wanted them to see what I'd built from the wreckage of our family dysfunction. Robert called me the day he received his invitation. I'll be there, he said simply. And Caroline, this is beautiful. Martha would be so proud. I didn't hear from my parents. The day of the launch arrived warm and sunny, the venue's garden in full bloom. Tables were set up outside, white linens fluttering in the breeze, the catering impeccable, but not ostentatious. I'd wanted it to feel welcoming, not intimidating. This wasn't about showing off wealth. It was about opening doors. Guests arrived throughout the afternoon. I greeted educators who'd submitted nominations for potential scholars. I met young women who'd applied for the first cohort of scholarships, brilliant students with the stories that echoed my own. One girl, 18 and heading to MIT in the fall, told me her parents had wanted her to become a nurse, like her mother had called engineering unfeminine and impractical. She'd applied to college in secret, funded her application fees with money from a part-time job. I saw myself in her fierce determination in the way she held her shoulders back despite the tremor in her voice. At 4 o'clock, Diane called everyone to attention. The crowd gathered in the garden, filling the white chairs we'd set up, facing a small podium. I stood to the side watching them settle and caught sight of Robert, slipping into a seat near the back. He was alone. My parents, as expected, had not come. Or so I thought. Diane introduced me with warmth and grace, sharing stories Martha had told her about the little girl who'd built model airplanes in her grandfather's garage, who'd never given up despite a family that couldn't see her potential. Then she invited me to speak. I walked to the podium and looked out at the faces watching me. Educators and innovators, donors and dreamers, young women who reminded me of who I'd been and who I'd fought to become. "Thank you all for being here," I began. 6 months ago, I lost someone who was more family to me than most people related by blood. Martha Knight worked as a housekeeper for my parents for 40 years, but that's not who she was to me. She was the person who remembered my birthday when my own mother forgot. She was the person who showed up to my college graduation when no one else did. She was the person who believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. I saw several people in the audience nodding understanding in their eyes. This fund exists because of Martha, and for every young woman who's been told she's not enough. For daughters who were invisible in their own homes. For students whose families couldn't or wouldn't see their potential. For anyone who's had to build their dreams alone because the people who should have supported them chose not to. My voice stayed steady, carrying across the quiet garden. Martha taught me something essential. She taught me that your worth isn't measured by who sees you, but by what you build when no one's watching. That success isn't about proving anyone wrong. It's about refusing to prove them right. I paused, letting that sink in. People ask me sometimes why I succeeded. They want to know if it was intelligence or determination or luck. And the truth is, it was all of those things. But mostly it was spite. Surprised laughter rippled through the audience. Not malicious spite, not the kind that tears others down, but the healthy kind of spite that says, "You don't think I can do this. Watch me." The spite that converts doubt into fuel. I looked directly at the young women in the audience, the scholarship applicants, who'd know exactly what I meant. I didn't build my empire to prove my family wrong. I built it because I refused to prove them right. I refused to be small. I refused to be forgettable. I refused to accept that my worth was determined by whether they chose to see it. Several women in the audience were crying now, including the MIT-bound student I'd spoken with earlier. Martha taught me one more crucial lesson, I continued. She taught me that blood makes you related, but loyalty makes you family. That the people who show up, who believe in you, who celebrate your victories and hold you through your failures, those are your real family regardless of biology. I felt emotion thickening my voice and paused to collect myself. Martha was more of a mother to me than biology ever provided. She saw me when I was invisible. She loved me when I was unlovable. She believed in me when I was drowning in self-doubt. And this fund, these scholarships, this opportunity we're creating for young women who need what I needed, this is how we honour her. Not with flowers or plaques, but by making sure no one has to walk the path alone the way I did. The audience rose in applause and I saw tears on many faces. Diane hugged me when I stepped away from the podium. The MIT student approached afterward and thanked me with shaking hands. An educator told me she knew at least 5 students who desperately needed this opportunity. It was perfect, exactly what Martha would have wanted. As the event was winding down and guests were saying their goodbyes, Diane approached me with an envelope. "This came in this morning's mail," she said. "Anonymous donation." I opened it and found a check for $100,000. No name, No note, just the donation and a return address. I recognized my parents' accountant's office. Later that evening, I received a text from Robert. Mom and Dad both donated, separately. Neither one knows about the other. Dad's was 100k, Mum's was 50k. They asked that their names not be used. I stared at the message for a long time. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a relationship. But it was something. An acknowledgement, a contribution to something that mattered. A way of honouring Martha without having to face their own guilt directly. I texted back, "Thank you for telling me." The fund launched successfully. By the end of June, we'd selected our first cohort of 20 scholars. By August, we'd received over 300 applications for the following year. The media coverage was extensive and overwhelmingly positive, with several major publications running features on the tech CEO who turned family rejection into opportunity for others. I framed the first scholarship award letter and hung it in my office next to the model airplane I'd built with my grandfather when I was 10. And on December 24th, exactly 1 year after I'd flown that jet, over my parents' Christmas party, I received an unexpected letter. The letter arrived in a cream-coloured envelope with my mother's distinctive handwriting. Not an email, not a text. A physical letter, the kind of formal communication she'd always preferred for important occasions. I stared at it for several minutes before opening it, my coffee growing cold on my desk. Inside was a single card with an embossed border. The message was brief. "Caroline, your father and I would like to invite you to a quiet dinner at home. Just family. Robert and his fiancée. Us. You. No party, no guests. No spectacle, just a meal together. December 18th at 7 if you're available. I understand if you're not. Patricia." The formality was so characteristic, it almost made me smile. Even in reaching out, my mother couldn't quite let go of her need for proper etiquette, for doing things the correct way. But there was something in the simplicity of it, in the acknowledgement that I might refuse, that felt different from before. I set the card on my desk and looked at it for 2 days before responding. When I finally did, I sent a text message to my mother's cell phone, deliberately choosing the less formal medium to establish that we'd be doing this on equal terms, not according to her rules of propriety. "I'll come on the 18th, but I have conditions. 1, neutral topics only. No rehashing the past. No unsolicited advice about my life or choices. 2, no apologies. We've said what needs to be said. 3, 2 hours maximum. I arrive at 7. I leave by 9. 4. If anyone becomes hostile or brings up old grievances, I leave immediately. Do you accept these terms?" Her response came an hour later. "Yes, thank you for coming." I flew to Connecticut on the 17th and stayed at my usual hotel. The next evening, I drove to my parents' house with my stomach in knots, though I couldn't say exactly what I was nervous about. I'd faced them down in public. I'd exposed their schemes, I'd drawn boundaries and held them. What was there to be nervous about now? But as I pulled up to the familiar mansion lit warmly against the December darkness, I realised what I was feeling wasn't nervousness. It was grief. Grief for what this could have been if my family had been different. If my mother had healed. If my father had been brave. If I'd been born into a home where love was given freely rather than withheld as punishment. Robert answered the door, and for a moment we just looked at each other. Then he smiled, genuine and warm, and pulled me into a brief hug. "I'm glad you came," he said quietly. "Me too," I said, and was surprised to find I meant it. His fiancée Amanda was in the living room, and she greeted me with kind eyes and an easy manner that suggested Robert had told her everything. My father stood by the fireplace, older and greyer than I remembered from 6 months ago, and he nodded to me with something in his expression that might have been hope or relief, or simply resignation. My mother emerged from the kitchen, and I saw that she'd prepared the meal herself, no catering staff, no elaborate presentation. She wore a simple dress and minimal jewellery, her hair styled but not stiff with product. She looked almost approachable. "Caroline," she said, and there was a question in how she said my name as if asking permission to be in the same room. "Mother," I replied, keeping my voice neutral, but not cold. We moved to the dining room where the table was set for 5. Not the grand table that seated 24, but the smaller one in the breakfast nook, the one that suggested family rather than performance. The food was simple roasted chicken vegetables, a salad, the kind of meal Martha used to make, I realised, and wondered if that was intentional. Conversation started slowly, awkwardly, like a car engine trying to turn over in cold weather. My father asked about my flight. I asked about his golf game. Robert mentioned he and Amanda were planning a spring wedding, and would I be willing to come if invited? I said I would. "Tell us about the Martha Knight Fund," Amanda said, and I silently blessed her for choosing a safe topic that allowed me to talk about something I cared about without veering into dangerous territory. I told them about the first cohort of scholars, about the MIT-bound student who reminded me of myself, about Diane's excellent leadership as executive director. My mother listened without interrupting, and when I mentioned the anonymous donations, I saw her eyes flicker briefly to my father, then away. "It's important work, my father said quietly. "Martha would be proud." "She would have been more practical about it," I said. "She'd have told me 10 million was too much, that I should keep some back for myself. But then she'd have cried over the scholarship letters." A small smile crossed my father's face. "That sounds exactly like her." We talked about Robert's new focus on pro bono work, about Amanda's marketing career, about my father's plans to finally retire at the end of the year. We discussed the weather, the upcoming holidays, a new restaurant that had opened in town. We talked about everything and nothing, avoiding the landmines of our shared history with careful precision. It was awkward. It was stilted. It was often silent for long stretches while we chewed our food and searched for safe conversational ground. But it was civil. We made it through the meal without warfare, without tears, without anyone leaving in anger. When dessert was finished, my mother offered coffee. I checked my watch, 8:45. "No, thank you," I said. "I should get going." There was visible disappointment on her face, but she didn't argue. She walked me to the door, my father and Robert hanging back in the dining room to give us a moment of privacy I hadn't asked for but didn't refuse. At the door, my mother hesitated, then moved as if to hug me. It was instinctive, automatic, the gesture of a mother saying goodbye to her daughter. But I stepped back slightly and extended my hand instead. For a moment, she looked stricken. Then, understanding crossed her face, followed by something that looked like acceptance. She took my hand and shook it formally, professionally, the way you'd say goodbye to a business acquaintance. "Thank you for coming," she said, and her voice was thick with emotion she was trying to contain. "Thank you for respecting my boundaries," I replied. Her smile was sad, but genuine. "I'm trying to learn how." My father walked me to my car, his hands shoved in his pockets against the December cold. When we reached my rental car, he stopped and turned to face me. "Thank you for this much," he said. "For coming. For giving us the chance to try. It's more grace than we earned." "You're right." I agreed, not to be cruel, but because it was true. "It is more than you earned," but Martha taught me that holding on to anger takes more energy than letting it go. This isn't forgiveness. It's just choosing not to let the past consume my present. He nodded slowly. "I wish I'd been braver. 35 years ago, 5 years ago, even 1 year ago, I wish I'd stood up to your mother, protected you, been the father you deserved." "You weren't," I said simply, "but you can be better now, not for the past, but for whatever relationship we build from here." "Is that possible?" he asked, "building something new?" "I don't know," I admitted, "but tonight was a start, a small one, but a start." He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. "I wanted to give you this. I should have given it to you years ago." Inside was a photograph, old and slightly faded. It showed my grandfather and me in his workshop. I couldn't have been more than 8 years old. We were bent over a model airplane, his hand guiding mine as we attached a wing. Both of us were smiling, completely absorbed in the work. "He took so many pictures of you two together," my father said. "After he died, your mother wanted to pack them all away. Said it was too painful to look at. I kept this one, kept it in my desk all these years." His voice cracked slightly. "He knew you'd fly someday. He always knew." I stared at the photograph, at the little girl I'd been at, the grandfather who'd seen me when no one else did. "Thank you," I managed. "This means more than you know." "He'd be proud of you," my father said, "just like Martha was, just like I am, even though I have no right to be." I got in my car and started the engine, letting it warm up while my father stood in the driveway watching. Before I pulled away, I rolled down the window. "Dad," I called. He stepped closer. The anonymous donation, the $100,000, it helped fund 3 full scholarships this year. Those 3 women are getting the chance I almost didn't get. So thank you. Even if it was guilt money, it's doing good in the world. His eyes glistened in the porch light. It wasn't guilt money. It was belief money. Believing in what you're building, even if I'm too late to help build it with you. I nodded and rolled up the window, put the car in gear and drove away. As I headed back toward the hotel, past the familiar Connecticut landscape that had been the backdrop of my childhood, I felt something I hadn't felt in 35 years. Not happiness exactly, not triumph or vindication or even satisfaction. Something simpler and more profound than any of those. I felt light. That feeling of lightness stayed with me through the days that followed. I flew back to San Francisco, returned to work, attended holiday parties with colleagues who'd become friends. The Martha Knight Fund sent out acceptance letters to the spring cohort. Aquila Air secured 2 major new contracts. Life continued with the momentum I'd built, and for the first time in my memory, I wasn't constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But as December 24th approached, I found myself thinking more and more about the previous year, about standing at my parents' gate being turned away, about the jet circling overhead, about Martha's confession and death, about every confrontation and revelation that had transformed my relationship with my family from toxic to bearable, from warfare to wary peace. On Christmas Eve morning, exactly 1 year after that dramatic scene, I woke early in my San Francisco apartment and made myself coffee. The city was quiet, most people still sleeping or preparing for family gatherings. I sat at my desk with a blank sheet of paper and a pen, and I did something I'd done a few times before during difficult periods of my life. I wrote a letter to my younger self. It was a ritual I'd started in my 20s, a way of processing grief and growth of marking transitions. The letters were never sent, of course. They couldn't be. But writing them helped me articulate what I'd learned, helped me speak to the parts of myself that were still wounded and waiting for someone to acknowledge their pain. I dated the letter December 24th and began to write, "Dear 8-year-old Caroline." I wrote, and immediately felt tears prick my eyes. "Right now, you're sitting at the kitchen table with Martha eating chocolate cake she made because Mum and Dad forgot your birthday. You're trying not to cry because you think crying makes you weak, makes you the dramatic child Mum says you are. You're wondering what you did wrong, why you're not important enough to remember." I paused, seeing that little girl so clearly in my mind. Small and serious, wearing a dress that was too big because it was a hand-me-down from some cousin trying so hard to be good enough to earn love. "I want you to know something," I continued. "They forgot your birthday, yes, but you're going to remember everyone who showed up. Martha made you cake. Grandpa called from his workshop to sing happy birthday, even though his voice was rough from the cancer he didn't know he had yet. Mrs. Henderson from next door brought you a book about airplanes because she remembered you loved them. That's what love looks like. Not perfection, not grand gestures, just showing up, just remembering, just caring enough to try. I wrote about the birthdays that would come after, about learning that love wasn't measured in parties or presents, but in the quiet consistency of people who chose to see you. Dear 16-year-old Caroline, I wrote next, and this section came easier with less pain. I'd processed this particular wound more thoroughly over the years. Tomorrow is your high school graduation, your valedictorian. You worked yourself sick to earn that honour, thinking, maybe if you were the very best, they'd have to show up. They won't. They'll drive to New Haven instead for Robert's mock trial award. You'll stand on that stage alone, and you'll smile for a photo with your principal, because there's no one else to take your picture. I stopped writing and looked out my window at the San Francisco skyline, remembering that day so vividly. The weight of the graduation gown, the sound of my name being called, the moment of scanning the audience for familiar faces and finding none. But here's what you need to know, I continued. You're going to walk across bigger stages. You're going to give keynote speeches at conferences where thousands of people listen. You're going to stand in front of cameras and investors and competitors, and you're going to do it with confidence because you learned early that you could succeed without an audience. Alone doesn't mean unloved. Alone doesn't mean worthless. Sometimes alone just means you're strong enough to walk forward even when no one's holding your hand. I wrote about MIT, about Boeing, about all the times I'd achieved something remarkable and had no one to call, no one to share it with. About learning to celebrate my own victories, to be proud of myself, even when pride from others never came. Dear 22-year-old Caroline, I wrote, and this one was harder again because this was the age when I truly believed that achievement would equal love, that if I just succeeded hard enough, loud enough, publicly enough, my family would finally see me. You just graduated from MIT summa cum laude. You sent a photo home. It took them 3 weeks to respond, and when they did, it was to tell you about Robert's accomplishment. You're sitting in your tiny apartment, crying, thinking you're not good enough, that you'll never be good enough. My hand cramped from writing, but I pushed through. You need to know this now, even though you won't learn it for another 13 years. You are enough. You were always enough. Their inability to see you was never about your worth. It was about their capacity, their wounds, their limitations. You cannot earn love that someone isn't capable of giving. You cannot achieve your way into their hearts if their hearts are closed. Stop trying. Please, please stop trying. Save that energy for building something that matters. I wrote about the years at Boeing, about the quiet discrimination and the stolen designs and the relentless work that nearly broke me, about learning that success wasn't about proving anyone wrong, but about refusing to prove them right, about building something extraordinary, not for an audience, but for myself. Dear 28-year-old Caroline, I wrote, and now I was approaching the turning point, the moment when everything shifted. You're about to quit your VP job and start a company with $50,000 and a garage. Everyone thinks you're crazy. Your parents will think you've lost your mind when they find out, though it'll take them years to find out because you've stopped sharing your life with them. You're terrified you're going to eat vending machine food and sleep on a couch and question everything about yourself for 18 months. I smiled, remembering that desperation and hunger and impossible determination. But you're going to make it. Investor 48 is going to say yes, and you won't know until much later that it's Dad that he believed in you enough to risk his career. You're going to build Aquila Air into something remarkable. You're going to employ 200 people. You're going to design aircraft that change the industry. You're going to make more money than you ever dreamed of, and you're going to use it to help other women who were dismissed the way you were dismissed. I wrote about the Christmas party, about the jet, about finally demanding to be seen, about Martha's death and the truths she revealed, about boundaries and forgiveness and learning that peace doesn't require closeness. Finally, I wrote to my present self. Dear 35-year-old Caroline, I wrote my hand shaking now with emotion. You did it. You survived the childhood that should have broken you. You built an empire from rejection. You turned pain into purpose. You learned to love yourself when no one else would. You're enough. You're more than enough. You always were. Tears fell onto the paper, smudging the ink slightly, but I kept writing. The little girl who used to lie in the grass, staring at clouds, wondering if she mattered, wondering if anyone would notice if she disappeared, she's flying now. Not in the metaphorical sense, though, that's true too, but literally flying, piloting aircraft she designed herself, looking down at the world from 30,000 feet and knowing that she's exactly where she belongs. I paused, gathering my thoughts for the final paragraph. You spent so many years trying to prove you were worthy of their love. You finally learned you didn't need their approval to fly. But here's the real truth, the one that took 35 years to understand. You were never grounded by them. You were only ever grounded by yourself, by the belief that their vision of you mattered more than your vision of yourself. The moment you stopped looking for permission to soar was the moment you realized you'd had wings all along. I signed the letter simply, "With love, Caroline." I folded it carefully, placed it in an envelope, and sealed it. Then I drove to the cemetery where Martha was buried, a small plot in a Baptist cemetery in Hartford that I'd helped pay for because she'd had almost nothing when she died. It was cold and overcast, threatening snow. The cemetery was empty, everyone home with their families on Christmas Eve. I stood in front of Martha's simple headstone and pulled out the letter. "Hey, Martha," I said aloud, feeling only slightly foolish. "I wrote something I wanted to share with you." I read the entire letter aloud, my voice carrying across the quiet cemetery. When I finished, I stood there for a long moment holding the envelope. "Thank you," I said finally, "for seeing me, for loving me, for teaching me that family is made, not given. I hope you're proud of what we built. The fund is going to help so many women who needed what you gave me." I knelt and placed the letter against the headstone, weighted down with a small rock so it wouldn't blow away. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I let myself cry without trying to stop it, without judging myself for weakness, without worrying about being dramatic or too emotional. I cried for the little girl who'd eaten cake alone. I cried for the teenager who'd graduated without family. I cried for the woman who'd built an empire while longing for a mother's pride. I cried for all the versions of myself who'd been brave and broken and beautiful and strong. And when I was finished, I felt lighter still. I sealed the letter, drove to Martha's grave, and read it aloud. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I cried. Not the silent, controlled tears I'd learnt to hide as a child, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook my whole body. I cried for every version of myself who'd been brave when she shouldn't have had to be, for every small Caroline who'd blown out birthday candles alone, for every achievement celebrated in solitude, for every moment of wondering if I was worthy of love. When the tears finally subsided, I sat back on my heels and wiped my face with my coat sleeve. The winter air was sharp and cold, but I felt cleansed, emptied of something I'd carried for far too long. I stood slowly, my legs stiff from kneeling, and looked at Martha's headstone one more time. "I'm going home now," I said softly. "But I'm coming back. I promise." I walked back to my rental car and sat behind the wheel for a long moment, not starting the engine. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the cemetery. Christmas Eve. 1 year ago, I'd flown a jet over my parents' mansion. Tonight, I was going to fly again, but this time for different reasons entirely. I pulled out my phone and called my pilot James, who was on standby in Connecticut. "Change of plans," I said. "I want to fly back to San Francisco myself tonight. Can you have the Aquila 9 ready at Hartford Executive in an hour?" There was a pause. "You want to solo pilot on Christmas Eve?" Yes. Then I'll have her fueled and ready. Flight plan to SFO. Yes, but I want to take a specific route. I'll file it when I get there. An hour later, I stood on the tarmac at the small executive airport looking at the Aquila 9 gleaming under the floodlights. My aircraft. My design. My dream made tangible and real. The ground crew had her ready pre-flight checks, complete navigation systems, programmed with the route I'd requested. I climbed into the cockpit and settled into the pilot's seat, running through my checklist with the practiced ease of thousands of hours of flight time. The familiarity of it soothed me, the ritual of preparation, the systematic verification that everything was exactly as it should be. Tower cleared me for takeoff, and I guided the aircraft down the runway, feeling the acceleration press me back into my seat. The moment of liftoff when the wheels left the ground and the earth fell away beneath me never stopped feeling like magic, like freedom given form. I climbed to 30,000 feet, the aircraft responding to every input with precision. Below me, Connecticut spread out in a patchwork of lights and shadows, towns and forests, roads and rivers. The sky above was clear and dark stars beginning to appear as the last light faded from the western horizon. I adjusted my heading slightly and watched as my navigation system showed me approaching my parents' estate. From 30,000 feet, I could see the mansion, its windows glowing warm in the darkness. They were having another party smaller than last year's extravaganza, but still elegant, still carefully curated. Cars lined the driveway. People moved past lit windows. I circled, once high enough that no one on the ground would hear my engines would know I was there. I looked down at that house where I'd spent 18 years feeling invisible, and I felt nothing but peace. No anger, no longing, no need for them to look up and see me. I was flying, and that was enough. I remembered being 8 years old, lying in the grass of that very lawn on a summer afternoon. The grass had been freshly cut, and it smelled like green growing things and possibility. I'd stared up at the sky, watching contrails from passing jets draw white lines across the blue, and wondered what it would feel like to fly. To be up there, instead of down here. To be free. That little girl had thought that flying was about escape, about getting away from the pain and disappointment of her family. She'd thought that if she could just get high enough, far enough, fast enough, she could leave all the hurt behind. But she'd been wrong. Flying wasn't about escape. It was about perspective. From 30,000 feet, everything looked different. The house that had loomed so large in my childhood was just one building among thousands. The people who'd made me feel small were just human beings, flawed and struggling in their own ways. I'd spent so much of my life trying to be seen from the ground, trying to make myself visible to people who'd chosen not to look. And all along, the answer hadn't been to get them to look up. It had been to rise high enough that their gaze no longer mattered. I completed my circle and banked west, setting course for San Francisco. The flight would take about 5 hours crossing the country, in darkness chasing the night toward morning. I engaged the autopilot and sat back looking out at the vast darkness punctuated by tiny points of light below. I thought about the year that had passed, about Martha dying in my arms, about confronting my family with evidence of their betrayal, about establishing boundaries that protected me while allowing for the possibility of limited connection, about creating the scholarship fund that would help other women who'd been where I'd been. I thought about the dinner a week ago, about sitting at that table and making awkward conversation, about shaking my mother's hand instead of hugging her, about my father giving me the photograph of Grandpa and me, about Robert becoming someone I could talk to if not yet fully trust. It wasn't the family I dreamed of having. It wasn't reconciliation in any traditional sense. But it was honest. It was real. It was possible. And sometimes possible was enough. The radio crackled with the routine communications from air traffic control. Other pilots checking in, reporting positions and altitudes. I was part of a network of people in the sky, all of us navigating our separate paths, connected by protocols and airwaves, but ultimately alone in our cockpits, but alone didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt peaceful, chosen, mine. I crossed into California airspace as dawn began to break behind me, the sky turning from black to deep blue to the soft grey that preceded sunrise. San Francisco Bay appeared below the bridges, and the city and the water, all painted in the colours of early morning. I contacted the tower and received clearance to land. The descent was smooth, the aircraft responding perfectly to every adjustment. When the wheels touched down on the runway, I felt the satisfying thump of arrival, of journey completed. I taxied to the private hangar where Aquila Air kept its fleet and shut down the engines. The sudden silence after hours of flight was profound. I sat in the cockpit for a moment, my hands still on the controls, unwilling to let go of this feeling quite yet. A knock on the fuselage made me look down. Diane Martha's niece and the executive director of the fund stood on the tarmac, with 2 cups of coffee in her hands and a smile on her face. I climbed down from the cockpit, accepting the coffee gratefully. "You didn't have to come meet me," I said. "Are you kidding? I wanted to, plus I have news." Her smile widened. 15 new scholarship applications came in yesterday. Christmas Eve and people are still applying. We're going to need to expand the program faster than we thought. I felt warmth spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. Martha would have loved that. She would have told us we were crazy and then helped us process every single application, Diane said. I miss her. Me too. We stood together on the tarmac as the sun rose fully over the bay, painting the water gold and orange. Ground crew moved around us, preparing other aircraft going about their morning routines. My aircraft, the Aquila 9 that had carried me across the country, sat behind us with its wings still warm from flight. "Welcome home, boss," Diane said, raising her coffee cup in a small toast. Home. I turned the word over in my mind, testing it. For so many years, home had meant Connecticut. That mansion, that family, that constant striving to belong somewhere that had never wanted me. I'd thought that if I could just earn my place there, I'd finally feel like I had a home. But standing here on the tarmac with the sun rising and the smell of jet fuel and coffee in the air with Diane, beside me talking about scholarships that would change lives, I realised something fundamental. Home had never been a place I needed to return to. Home was what I'd built for myself. It was the company I'd created from nothing. It was the fund bearing Martha's name. It was the aircraft I'd designed and the pilots I'd trained and the employees who believed in the vision I'd cast. It was the freedom to fly wherever I chose and to land wherever I wanted. Home wasn't where my family was. Home was where I was free to fly. In the end, I hadn't parked my jet outside my parents' mansion to prove anything to them. I'd done it to prove something to myself, to finally let go of the desperate need for their approval, to close the door on a chapter of my life that had been written by other people's expectations and limitations. I'd spent 35 years waiting to be seen, but visibility from the wrong people had never been worth pursuing. The people who mattered, the Marthas and Dianes and Roberts who finally woke up of the world they'd seen me all along. I'd just been too busy looking in the wrong direction to notice. The little girl who'd lain in the grass wondering if she mattered had her answer now. She mattered because she decided she mattered. Her worth wasn't determined by who acknowledged it, but by what she built with her own hands, by whom she helped with her resources, by how she chose to show up in the world, even when the world tried to make her invisible. And she was flying now, not to escape, not to prove anything, not to be seen from below, but because she finally understood that she'd had wings all along. She just needed permission from herself to use them. I finished my coffee and handed the empty cup back to Diane. "Come on," I said, "let's go review those scholarship applications. We've got 15 more women to help learn how to fly." And I've been flying ever since. If Caroline's story resonated with you, if you've ever felt invisible in your own family or doubted your worth because someone else couldn't see it, I want you to know something important. You are not alone. Thousands of women watching this right now have walked similar paths, have carried similar wounds, have wondered if they were enough when the people who should have loved them unconditionally chose not to. Caroline's journey teaches us that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean pretending the hurt never happened, or that toxic relationships can be fixed with a single conversation. True healing means establishing boundaries that protect your peace, while releasing the anger that poisons your present. It means understanding that some people are too broken to give what you need from them, and that's not a reflection of your worth, but of their capacity. What struck me most about Caroline's story is how she transformed rejection into purpose. She didn't just succeed despite her family's dismissal. She built something that helps other women who were dismissed the same way. The Martha Knight Fund exists because Caroline chose to turn her pain into opportunity for others. That's not just success. That's legacy. That's taking the worst thing that ever happened to you and using it to ensure it happens to fewer people in the future. And here's what I want every daughter, every sister, every woman who's been made to feel small to understand. Your worth is not determined by who sees you. Your value doesn't increase because someone finally acknowledges it, and it doesn't decrease because they refuse to. You are inherently worthy, inherently valuable, inherently enough, whether anyone recognizes it or not. The moment you stop seeking permission to be yourself is the moment you become truly free. Caroline spent decades trying to earn love from people incapable of giving it. She achieved extraordinary things, not for herself at first, but to prove she deserved the acceptance that should have been freely given. Only when she stopped performing for an audience that refused to watch did she discover what real success felt like. Not the external markers of achievement, though. Those came, but the internal peace of knowing she was enough exactly as she was. I also want to talk about what this story teaches us about chosen family. Martha wasn't Caroline's biological mother, but she was more of a mother than biology ever provided. She showed up, she remembered, she believed, she loved without conditions or expectations. That's what family should be. And if your biological family can't provide it, you have every right to build your own family from people who choose to see you, support you, and celebrate you. Some of you watching this are estranged from your families. Some of you have set boundaries that your relatives call cruel or unnecessary. Some of you are wondering if you're wrong for choosing distance over dysfunction. Let me be clear. You are not obligated to maintain relationships that harm you, even if those relationships are with family. Blood does not entitle anyone to damage you repeatedly. You have the right to protect your peace, your mental health, and your well-being, even if it means disappointing people who never worried about disappointing you. But here's the beautiful part of Caroline's story that gives me so much hope. Boundaries don't have to mean permanent estrangement. They can mean creating enough space for people to change while protecting yourself in the process. Caroline's relationship with her mother will never be what it could have been, will never erase the damage done, but it became something honest and manageable. Not close, but civil. Not warm, but respectful. And sometimes that's the best possible outcome when dealing with people who've hurt you deeply. The dinner scene, where Caroline shakes her mother's hand instead of hugging her, is one of the most powerful moments in this entire story. It would have been easy to write a fairy tale ending where everyone cries and hugs and pretends 35 years of neglect can be erased. But real life doesn't work that way. Real healing is messy and incomplete and requires maintaining boundaries even when it hurts to do so. Caroline honoured both her need for self-protection and her willingness to allow limited connection. That's wisdom, not coldness. Now I want to hear from you because your stories matter just as much as Caroline's. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Have you achieved something remarkable only to have it dismissed or minimised by the people who should have celebrated you? Are you currently struggling with whether to maintain contact with family members who've hurt you? Or have you already made the difficult decision to establish boundaries or Walk away entirely. Share your story in the comments below. Tell us about the Martha in your life, the person who saw you when your family didn't. Tell us about your own Aquila heir, whatever you built from the ashes of rejection. Tell us how you learned that you were enough, or if you're still learning that lesson. This community is here for you, and your story might be exactly what another woman needs to hear today to keep going, to keep building, to keep flying. And if you found value in Caroline's journey, if this story made you feel seen or understood or less alone, please subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. We share stories like this every week, stories about women who refused to be small, who transformed pain into power, who built extraordinary lives not despite their struggles, but because of what those struggles taught them. Your subscription helps us reach more women who need to hear these messages, who need to know they're not alone in their battles with family dysfunction, self-doubt, or the journey towards self-acceptance. Leave a comment telling us which part of Caroline's story hit you hardest. Was it the childhood journals showing her evolution from seeking their love to not needing it? Was it Martha's death and final revelations? Was it the moment Caroline chose peace over revenge? Was it the scholarship fund that turned her pain into purpose for others? Let us know, because your engagement helps the algorithm show this video to more people who need its message. Like this video, if you believe in chosen family, if you've ever had to set boundaries with relatives, if you understand that forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation, or if you've learned that your worth isn't determined by who acknowledges it, your like is more than just a metric. It's a signal to other women that they're not alone, that their struggles are valid, that their choices to protect themselves are justified. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe it's a friend who's struggling with family estrangement. Maybe it's a daughter who's trying to earn love from emotionally unavailable parents. Maybe it's a woman who's achieved incredible things but still feels the weight of childhood rejection. This story could be the permission they need to stop seeking approval from people who will never give it and start building the life they deserve. Remember, you don't need permission to fly. You never did. The only thing grounding you is the belief that someone else's vision of you matters more than your own. The moment you release that belief is the moment you discover you've had wings all along. Thank you for watching, for engaging, for being part of this community. Until next time, keep flying.